Greetings, loyal listeners! This is the Real Context News Podcast, and I am Brian Freidenborg, its host. Today is January 5th, 2024, and I'm very proud to be presenting to you my interview from December 29th, 2023, with Rula Jebreal, a Palestinian journalist, analyst, and author, with whom I discussed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a wider sense, but also in a detailed sense. It's a good complement to my interview with Noga Tarnopolsky. And Rula is just an amazing person. I get into some of her accomplishments and background in the podcast, and it was really an honor to interview her. We definitely had our disagreements, and I think her perspective is very important because it shows how much incredible work needs to be done by the American government, by the Biden administration, to rebuild bridges, to rebuild trust, to work on the relationship with Palestinians, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, who are looking at this differently than many other people in the country are looking at it. And they feel very betrayed. Generally speaking, they feel this is a very one-sided approach. I have my own views which differ from Rula, and we do get into that. I do think Biden is really trying very hard behind the scenes to make certain things happen. I also think that the idea that the United States cutting off military aid or allowing votes in the Security Council, the idea that that would somehow make Israel move 180 degrees in the opposite direction or get them to stop the fighting in Gaza, let alone the occupation. I do not think that that would have as much effect as people who are holding the Biden administration more responsible as they think it would have. However, it's possible I'm wrong. Rula makes a very good case, and she's worth hearing for sure because she has decades of experience covering these topics. She's been very outspoken as a journalist against fascism and for human rights, no matter where and no matter what is happening. So she does have consistency there, which is to be admired these days because a lot of people are unfortunately very selective with their application of their outrage and of what humans' rights matter and do not. And she definitely deserves to be part of the conversation, the national conversation, the international conversation. And while she has been getting on television a lot more recently, these clips are often very short, a few minutes. There's not really the time to get into the context. And that's why I was so excited to get into that context with Rula. So without further ado, this is my interview with her over 2 hours from the end of the year. And I'm very proud to be posting it now. Here you have my interview with Rula Jebreal. Greetings, Rula. I'm very honored to have you here. Everybody, this is Rula Jebreal. She is an amazing person that's hard to bottle or pin into one hole. She's a true Renaissance woman. Not only is she a journalist and a political analyst and even a war correspondent, she is an author of multiple books, including a novel, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And that was turned into a movie where she wrote the screenplay starring Freida Pinto. And she was even profiled in Vogue and photographed by Annie Leibovitz, of all people. How many geopolitical experts and journalists can say that? So she has done so many different amazing, interesting things in her life, lived in so many interesting places. So we're going to get right into it. Your first novel, Miral, which was turned into a movie by the same name, has a lot to do with who you are and your background and your identity and how it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to what's happening right now in Gaza. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And as you mentioned before we began, that's a great way to introduce the audience to you and to the topic of the day. So without further ado, please do tell us about your novel and that film.
Thank you, Brian. And the book Miral, which was translated in multiple languages and was written in 2003 at the height of the Iraq War. And it is incredible that that was the first time I decided to write a book. For me, it was clear that America's foreign policy in the Middle East was catastrophic, was misguided, and was based on a lie. The lie was the WMD. But while we were debating in the media, ultimately talking points that paved the way for the war in Iraq, the destabilization of the Middle East, a war that paved the way for ISIS and mass radicalization. It is astonishing that in 2023, the same talking point are being used by some of the people who actually led the Iraq war. Top advisor to President Biden is a guy that became very prominent during the Iraq war. And now we're listening to similar talking points about Gaza. De-Baathification became de-Hamasification. The destruction, which basically there's only a military solution, which obviously doesn't exist and will never work out, to the Middle East question. And we see the same racist colonial discourse that I heard in 2003. The same discourse that only military might and military power and crushing them and basically razing to the ground certain cities. And this discourse became normalized. But most people were not aware of the history of the Middle East. So I wanted to write a novel about where I grew up in and what happened in 1948 and why it's relevant, because the Nakba, which is the term that Palestinians use to describe their catastrophe in 1948, basically the depopulation, the exodus, the forced transfer of 750,000 Palestinians, basically kicking them out of their own homeland. How did that happen? That happened because there's a series of massacres that took place by the Irgun and the Haganah, which are the Zionist Jewish militia that terrorized Palestinian villages. One of these villages, the name of the village is Deir Yassin. So in April, the beginning of April 1948, the Haganah and the Irgun attacked this village and killed hundreds of people. They attacked it at night, they bombed homes, they burned people and children and basically exterminated the whole village. Some children managed to escape and they ran off with some survivors and they ended up in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem, there was this wealthy family, Al-Husseini. Their daughter, they had 5 boys and 1 girl. And the daughter, Hind, her name is Hind, found these children in the morning next to one of the gates of Jerusalem, and she was surprised. And when she asked them, they told her the story. They told her they were the survivors of Deir Yassin. She took them back home and she established an orphanage. How do I know that? Because I grew up in that orphanage. In 1978, 79, I arrived to the orphanage after the death of my mother. And because my father was very sick, so he basically gave us to this woman to raise us. And she already raised many generations of Palestinian orphans. Many of those were the survivors of massacres that took place in 1948. Those girls stayed in the orphanage. They arrived when they were babies, young girls, and some of them were 8-year-old, 7-year-old, 4-year-old, but somehow they were told the stories by other survivors. So they reminded us and they told us the stories. So when I see what's happening today in Gaza, and especially remembering the memories of those women who told us what happened precisely, the mass killing, the mass slaughter, rounding up men and shooting them all together, or destroying entire homes with entire families inside that home, wiping out entire families. That sounds very familiar to me, as history is repeating itself. And I was not surprised because I've been hearing Israeli officials invoking a second Nakba for years. I mean, even inside parliament, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, said Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job in 1948. We need to finish the job, and we need a second Nakba. A year ago, before Hamas's attack, a year ago, people were marching in my city in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, saying, kill all the Arabs. Far-right fanatics were marching together with members of parliament, the Knesset, and together with member of Jerusalem municipality, calling to erase Palestinians, to wipe out Palestinians. And Brian, what people don't understand, that this has been going on for a long time. The preparation for mass killing and extermination of Palestinians didn't happen over time. They just were, they needed an opportunity to carry it out, openly. What happened in the last, I would say, 2 decades, that you can see a pivot in the public discourse in Israel. And for somebody like me who consume a lot of Israeli media and listen to the rhetoric from Israeli politicians, there is a clear pivot 2 decades ago. And it came after Oslo. And Oslo was never really meant to deliver statehood to the Palestinians or even to free them. It was meant to contain them. It's like the whole discourse, like we need to contain and manage the conflict and divide the Palestinians in some kind of enclave, Bantustans, so we can control them even further while Israel build more illegal settlements and build walls and build cages.
And just so the audience, so they know, the Oslo Accords were the historic agreement that Clinton helped broker between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin in 1993 that began a process of the Palestinian Authority having some type of authority in the West Bank, depending on what Israel feels like giving it in a given time, regardless of what's on paper. But yeah, that was the historic agreement where they were on the White House lawn and shaking hands.
So why tell the story in 1948? It's because it's obviously the establishment of the State of Israel, and many, still the myth still endures that Israel came to a land without people, and the establishment of the state was basically very not at the cost of something else. Actually, even Israelis themselves, whether Benny Morris, the historian,
he's great. Yeah, I have his book right behind me, right there.
Yeah, Ben-Gurion himself talked about the need to ethnically cleanse Palestinians.
And in Rabin's memoirs, they censored that for many years in Israel. They didn't even let Israelis read what he wrote about what he saw with his own eyes.
Ben-Gurion himself talked about ethnically cleansing Palestinians as a condition to establish the State of Israel. And that is never discussed. The whole myth, when Ursula von der Leyen talked about the desert, you made the desert bloom. The desert was already bloomed because Palestinian farmers and native Palestinian population was living there, was cultivating the land for centuries. And the whole, the whole culture was was a culture that was multiracial, multi-religious communities, Christian and Muslims and Jews who lived there for centuries. And without the idea of racial domination, nobody dominated another. I mean, in centuries, we have the Crusades who tried to impose a Christian identity on everybody else. We know how this is end. But 1948 is very relevant because it is incredible, Brian. I was watching one of the soldiers, an old man in his late 80s, saying after the attack, after October attack, saying we need to go and we need to eradicate Palestinians completely, kill them, kill their children, kill their families. And his name was very familiar. So I went and Googled his name. And he is actually, as a young soldier, he participated in the Deir Yassin massacres in 1948. So the fact that there was never accountability for the war crimes that were committed in 1948, 1967, or during the Intifada or the 5 wars in Gaza created a culture in Israel, and a culture that truly terrifies me and should terrify anybody else, that the only way that they can relate to Palestinians and to the world is with extreme acts of violence. I mean, they're talking about exterminating Palestinians and committing genocide as if they're talking about grabbing a coffee from Starbucks, or they talk about, the weather. I mean, if you consume Israeli media like I do, and you see how they talk about casually, normally, with such ease about killing of people and killing of children and killing of innocent civilians. You
Or
are
mass displacement. I mean, the Jerusalem Post has had two op-eds in the recent since October 7th, calling for the mass displacement, but they don't say ethnic cleansing. They don't say mass displacement. They say this is a good plan. It's a good thing for them. We'll move them to the Sinai, or we'll have other countries take them. And
yeah.
they're saying it like it's a normal policy proposal to force hundreds of thousands, millions of people out of their homes. And this is published by respectable publications. This is Israel Hayom, where they've discussed these plans. This was a think tank paper. This was in the Jerusalem Post, where I saw two op-eds. I can't imagine the New York Times publishing an op-ed that we should just move all the Native Americans to one reservation, or we should, support something like that in Gaza. I can't imagine a U.S. paper in 2023 just casually publishing like it's any other op-ed. I mean, the only comparable thing I think of is that Tom Cotton essay about how to deal with Black Lives Matter protesters, and even that was scandalous and resulted in resignation. So the idea that this is the normal discourse, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister right now, is so good at this, and that he speaks certain things in English and he speaks other things in Hebrew. So he knows what he wants the American audience to hear and the English speaking audience to hear, but he uses different language when he's speaking in Hebrew. And it's
the double tongue strategy. But Brian, even in the Wall Street Journal, two Israeli officials published op-eds saying the only solution is basically population transfer, which is, another word. Otherwise, it's called ethnic cleansing, and so they're bombing the population in a, we call it the killing cage, Gaza. They're bombing to oblivion an entire population that is besieged, that is starved, and pushing them to the south, to the south, to the south. No place is safe, according even to the New York Times. They've been bombing areas where they ask people to move. After they ask them to move, they dropped basically 500 bombs. Each one was 2,000 pounds. And it's called dumb bomb because it obviously it's not a precision bomb.
And over 200 of those were in the south and in areas where they said, "Oh, evacuate here," because there's 200 of those 500-pound bombs. This is from the New York Times analysis.
Not only killing people, they're creating the condition for Gaza to be uninhabitable. So they're killing civilians at a rate that we've never seen in this century. They're not only killing them, you're
not just talking about Israel and Gaza. This rate of killing in recent decades, you have to go back to the Vietnam War.
Exactly. When Americans were burning alive.
Much longer period of time. This is just a few weeks and a couple months where this many people
napalms on civilian population. Now they're dropping white phosphorus and bombs that burn everything. They're burning children alive, and they're also destroying the hospital healthcare system. I mean, they created these lies, and they remind me of the Iraq lie for a reason, WMD, saying that under the hospitals, it's a command and control center for Hamas. That lie was debunked multiple times, and yet they managed to destroy, without any accountability, every hospital in Gaza. The whole healthcare system is collapsing in a moment of need, dire need for Palestinian civilians. And now we have diseases that
some detail on that. You're talking in particular, this was the Al-Shifa medical complex, where
not only Al-Shifa, Al-Quds Hospital, Rantisi Hospital.
Very specifically, they show the map. This would drove me crazy. They show the map where they had all of these positions marked out in red. All these positions marked out in red. This is this. This is that. This is a complex where the Israelis, actually Ehud Barak talked about how they had built some of the tunnel systems and they knew exactly where they were. And then they finally get there after denying a lot of food and a lot of water and medicine to people who were starving. Babies on incubators died. They made it sound like this was such a military threat, such a big command and control center, that they had to do that for the safety of the operation. And then they get there and there's almost no there were no Palestinian fighters there at that point. They couldn't find what they showed us on. They literally showed it to us on a map, and then they couldn't find it once they were there. And I just said to myself, my goodness, this is not adequate.
is how the state propaganda worked, Brian. The state propaganda lay at the ground, and it started immediately after October 7th with multiple claims that were
that doesn't mean that Hamas has never used hospital for this, that, or another military objective, but that doesn't mean just because there's a few Hamas fires, or maybe more than a few, that it's total fair game and you can do whatever you want to a hospital burning with patients. So just because they found some footage from a month ago, again, the justifications just simply weren't there. And Hamas is holed up and fighting to the death in a number of places. None of that happened at Shifa Hospital. They could have bypassed it. They could have surrounded it and allowed aid in, but they didn't.
You see, you have to go back to understand how the Israeli military structure operates. There's a specific doctrine that was developed in Lebanon during the invasion of Lebanon. And the structure that
in the 80s.
In the 80s. And then implemented also in 2006 during the second bombardment of Lebanon, destruction of Lebanon. And the doctrine was very clear. Civilians are a deliberate target. So, I mean, through military rule, they created their own rule and their own laws. International laws, humanitarian laws, or laws of wars are not applied in Israel. Israel created its own with the complicity of the international community, especially Europe and America. And there's this doctrine, specific doctrines, that any civilian is a legitimate target, children, women, and others. That's why you see a lot of soldiers bragging about killing civilians with such impunity. I mean, on CNN, I think in the second week of the war, there was an Israeli official interviewed by Abby Phillips, and he kept repeating, our war is not with Hamas, it's on civilians. That's why the rhetoric of even the president, Herzog, who signed basically on a missile his own name, said there's no civilians in Gaza, there's no innocent civilian in Gaza. Again, this narrative is being normalized that all Palestinians are a legitimate target, whether you're...
There's the U.S. congressman from Florida who stood up and said, saying they're innocent civilians. This is when they censored. I would agree with what she said, but I don't agree with them censoring Rashida Tlaib. He stood up and said, saying there are innocent civilians in Gaza is like saying that there were innocent Nazis in Germany. And again, this is a U.S. congressman in the state of Florida. I just am disheartened that there's this level of...
This is the normalization. This is because of lack of accountability, lack of transparency, and lack of information about what Israel is really pursuing, in not only in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. The ultimate goal here is to eradicate Palestinians. We're looking at literally a genocide being committed on multiple fronts with different means and different tools in Gaza, by bombardment and by starvation of the population. But also we're looking at the West Bank by settler terrorism backed by and militias backed by the army. And we're looking slowly at a situation where there's a new doctrine that's being unleashed with the backing of Europe and the United States, which places Israel above international law, that there's no accountability whatsoever, that Israel can do no wrong. There's no red lines, there's no conditionality, there's no proportionality of whatsoever what it is. And with that kind of impunity, with that kind of, we can do whatever we want because somehow we are victims, we're victims of in World War II. Now we are entitled to break all the rules, all the laws. And
by the way, that's what the argument that Hamas essentially makes. We're the victims, we're occupied, so we can conduct terrorism and we can massacre civilians on October 7th, and that's legitimate. And the fact that they're making these similar arguments, it's just that Hamas says it out loud and they're a little slicker about it, but when you read between the lines and you look at what they're actually doing, and then you have people like Smotrich who don't whisper it, they say it out loud.
I don't think they're any more slick about it. They're telling you with straight face, through their ministers, through their officials, exactly where their strategic goal lies. Even Bibi Netanyahu is so emboldened by Biden weakness and Biden complicity that I think a week ago he said that he's been lying for 30 years about the two-state solution. There will never be a two-state solution. He's been lying about, and he said that he's the only one that can control the Americans, and he's the only one that can manipulate the media. And you know what? He's right. He's been manipulating the media with state propaganda that's been repeated over and again, that the overwhelming majority of people really believe that Israel is the victim here. I mean, there's no, in international law, you can be an occupier demand the people who you occupy to guarantee your safety, and claim self-defense in a territory that you are occupying, that doctrine does not exist and should not exist. Plus, genocide is not a legitimate warfare. Extermination is not a legitimate warfare. Using of starvation and hunger is not a legitimate warfare.
So yes, I want to get into some of these things in a bit more detail and unpack them somewhat individually, and maybe even play a little devil's advocate, because there are a lot of people listening that I know would disagree with some of the things you said. And I agree with almost everything you said, but there's a couple things even I push back on it. So I'd love to have this open up a bit. First of all, when we're talking about Gaza, there's a lot of Israelis and American supporters and other supporters of Israel who would say, and I know you've heard this many times before, that Israel left Gaza. And now I've done my own work on this, where they create a buffer zone. They certainly control the airspace, the sea space. They don't allow anything in that they don't want. You can't leave without the permission. There's no sovereignty really in Gaza. So can you elaborate on the degree to which Israel left and did not leave Gaza in the mid-2000s, and how much control Israel still exerts over the Gaza Strip?
According to the State Department and the United Nations, Gaza is an occupied territories. These are not my opinion, these are the facts. What Israel did is take outside its settlements from the city to the outside Gaza, and then blockaded completely Gaza, the airspace, basically all the crossing borders are blockaded. Nothing come in and out of Gaza without Israel permission. And yes, they even control the Rafah border, which is with Egypt. And because of the peace treaty that Israel has with Egypt, they impose on Egypt when can get in and get out. So
just for our audience to understand, this is like someone being in your house and living there and abusing you. And then they leave the house, but then they wall off your house and they decide when you can leave your own house. So that when people are saying that the occupation ended, just imagine if that's your situation. It doesn't feel like the occupation ended. It just feels like they surrounded your house and they're still controlling you, right? Would that be a fair analogy?
I mean, it's at this point, it should be obvious to everybody when they manage to cut the water, the electricity, prevent the food and fuel and medicine to come in. I mean, I believe thousands of children limbs were amputated without anesthesia because they are preventing the anesthesia from coming in. Imagine a child who's 2 years old who had to be his leg and arm amputated, and there's thousands of those who've been amputated without anesthesia because Israel deliberately prevent the entrance of medication or food.
Israel would say that their claim is that Hamas is the one preventing the entry of these supplies. How would you respond to that?
Borders. Hamas does not control the borders. How can Hamas prevent anything when they don't control the borders? Israel always control the borders, and this is according to the United Nations. This is according to the U.S. State Department. This is according to every human rights organization on the ground. And so the lies are such that they are easily debunked.
Israel's invaded, so they more than control the entryways on their border. And then with the Rafah border, there are reporters and other UN officials there all the time. You never see Hamas gunmen running around with you just don't see. I mean, it's not that there aren't any security personnel, but there's not some kind of giant Hamas presence right at the border with Rafah. Those are just civilians there trying to manage some way of surviving. And then somehow we're supposed to believe that Hamas has that much control when they're down in their tunnels, they're hiding scared in their tunnels, and they're somehow controlling these supplies coming in and out. It just doesn't make sense.
When you're just, let's be logical here. The force, Hamas's force is between 20,000 and 40,000, according to Israel itself. They claim to have killed 8,000. Let's say that there's another 30,000. Can you really control a large territory and the crossing borders while Israel is bombing through this bombing campaign? The prevention of food and water and fuel and medication was a deliberate strategy from day one. And
they said that out loud. They did say that out loud. And I talked to a friend of mine. He's a Palestinian journalist who worked for an Egyptian station. And the thing with Egypt is that there's already been a bombing of the Rafah crossing where they had to repair the road. At least one water truck was attacked by Israel. And the message seemed to be, if Egypt tries to send an aid that Israel doesn't greenlight, that they'll be attacked, and the Egyptians are in this difficult position where they don't want to look weak. They don't want to look like they're not sending an aid because they're afraid of getting attacked by Israel. Because if they get attacked by Israel, then people are going to rise up and demand that the Egyptian army fights back, and that's definitely not what Sisi wants. So they're kind of like not able to do much unless they are willing to provoke greater conflict.
It is clear from day one that this is a deliberate strategy. When Gallant, the defense minister, went on television and said, no food, no water, no fuel, everything is sagor, everything is cut. We will cut everything. We will treat them like they're animals. He did not talk about Hamas. He talked about the 2 million Palestinian civilians, 2.2 Palestinians who live there. So it's upon the international community. Are you willing to sacrifice millions of people, obliterate international humanitarian law, and commit to basically allow Israel to get away with genocide, whether by bombing, by starvation? So because their professed goal is that, eradicating the Palestinian people. And whoever will survive, they want to push them into the desert, to the Sinai, and say, well, the only option we're going to give you in order to survive and not to kill you is to exit and become basically forever stateless people, refugees forever, and guest workers for other nations. I mean, this is a genocidal intent that has been reiterated, that is being implemented. This is a genocidal campaign that's being implemented with the total complicity of the United States. Joe Biden, this is his legacy. Gaza would be his legacy. In the Middle East, he's viewed worse than George W. Bush and worse than Trump. And believe me, around the Middle East, they understand who Trump is, and they understood and paid the price for Bush mistakes. Yet we're seeing a level of hatred, resentment towards the United States I never seen, even at the height of the Iraq War and at the height of the Afghan War.
So I do want to unpack some of that as well, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think I view things somewhat similarly, but also somewhat differently with some of the way that things are characterized. So I want to have like a bit of a back and forth and have you further explain your views, and I'll explain mine as well. In terms of the issue of genocide, and I've thought very long and hard about this, I feel like what you have is, on one hand, you clearly have people like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, other right-wing people. You have statements that Netanyahu himself has made, that some of the defense officials, Gallant and others, have made, where Gaza's not going to look like what it used to. Let's have a second Nakba. Let's have let's flatten Gaza. There are no innocent civilians. They should go to Sinai. We should be able to move them to Sinai. We should ask if other countries are willing to take them in. When you add all that together, you have a rhetorical campaign that is definitely setting the stage for a potential genocide. That's on one hand. Then you have the level of bombardment, which is incredible, and people don't realize. At the height of the anti-ISIS campaign, the most U.S. bombs that were dropped in a single month has been exceeded in 6 days, the first 6 days, by Israel. And the types of bombs the U.S. usually use were 500-pound bombs. Israel's using a lot of 2,000-pound bombs, as you have mentioned, and others that are larger than 500 pounds. So you add the level of death and destruction. Then you add this cutting off of food, water, and medicine. And there's certainly the possibility that this, I think, I'm not at the point where it's a genocide that's happening right now. It is war crimes. It is mass killing. I'm at the point where there are clearly people in the Israeli government that have genocidal intent and would like to mass cleanse Gaza. I don't know for a fact that that's the official policy of the government, in the sense that I don't think they're coherent or well led. I think there's constant infighting, and if the U.S. wasn't doing what Biden is doing to rein Israel in, and I'll get into that in a bit, I think there's a much greater chance that it could evolve into a genocide. I do think it's not as much as I would like to have seen at this point, but I also want to get into that. I do think it could get to there. I don't think it has, and I think there is a lot of international pushback. It's not so much public, it's not so much out loud, it's very much behind the scenes that is trying to prevent that, and is somewhat prevented. The fact that there's any food aid going in, it's not nearly enough. There should be 400 or 500 trucks a day, 100 or 10 or 50. It's nowhere near enough for 2.2 million people. The fact that any aid's going in at all is because Biden administration pushed back. And I think, and you may disagree, I think a lot of people may disagree, maybe you'll agree, I don't know. I think Biden's strategy with this is that
he was with Obama when Obama tried to push back against Israel. Not hard enough, but look at how that ended for him. He didn't do nearly enough, but anything he said out loud, it just didn't work. And Netanyahu is a right-wing nationalist, loves to tell his base, no one tells us what to do, even the Americans. The Americans need us more than we need them, which is absurd. And so those right-wing nationalists, they're like Maloney that you are familiar with in Italy, I feel like they love telling people, no one tells us what to do. And if they're publicly pressured, even by allies, their reaction is to defy those allies and to even do more. So I think if Biden very, very publicly at the early stage came down really hard on Netanyahu, they may have actually bombed more people further just to show we don't have to listen to them. I think what Biden's trying to do is build up credibility both with the Israeli people and with the Israeli government, so that by the end game, when it's so much worse, and Israel's in southern Gaza, and everyone's crammed in there, and it's way more densely populated, and in the post-war, where there's finally going to be not much Hamas power in Gaza, if any, and there'll be no excuse to not move forward on a two-state solution. I think Biden is trying to build up his credibility so that at the later part in the war, starting now more than before, and after the war, he'll have the leverage to be able to do what he needs to do, because I think Bibi will also be out of power. I know that's not the most comforting or reassuring proposal, but I do think that's what he's trying to do, because he knows this guy. Bibi is not someone that responds well to anything. He's defied U.S. president after U.S. president, and he's the biggest part of the problem to me.
So not only I disagree with what you said, I think the facts on the ground discredit this theory. I think Biden is as complicit as it goes. I don't think he learned anything from Obama. Obama won the second term. I am not sure Biden will win a second term, precisely because of his policies in Gaza. He alienated young people, he alienated progressive, he alienated Black people. If you talk with any African American, people who campaign for Biden and tell you that they voted for Biden, not because they really were inspired by Biden, but because they didn't trust the ability of white people to deliver Trump again, can tell you immediately that they feel they have empathy for Palestinians because they've been on the receiving end of repression throughout history. They understand what's happening. I just want to mention that Ehud Olmert, former prime minister of Israel, just came out and today and said that it is impossible to dismantle Hamas, that what Bibi Netanyahu is doing is not dismantling Hamas, is basically trying to stay in power by clinging to power through bombs and bombardment.
And Petraeus also suggested it wasn't a reasonable angle. That's too difficult.
What Biden is doing, not only he legitimized and normalized certain lies and talking points that made people go crazy thinking, oh my God, the atrocity that were committed will justify any violence, and been used to justify huge scale of violence. He even endorsed the big lie about the Shifa hospital, which turned out to be a huge lie, according to basically the investigation by the Washington Post. What Biden is doing is not only coward, is callous, he's destroying Democrats' possibility to win re-elections, but also he's destroying his own rule-based international order. How does that happen? The whole myth that, oh, he saw what happened with Obama and that's why he didn't want to repeat it, I don't believe that. I think Biden truly is, his foreign policy has been always abhorrent, has always been awful, and has been always colonial. If you look at what people were, even if you read Obama's book about the Arab Spring, how Biden wanted to rely on dictators to stay in power, regardless what they're doing, from Mubarak on. His whole myth about the Abrahamic Accord, which we don't need, we need to make normalize relationship between Israel and Arab regime. We need to give them weaponry. It doesn't matter that it's not popular in the region. It doesn't matter the popularity of these accords. He's not even listening to his American base, that 80% of Democrats want a ceasefire. So he's jeopardizing those calls and dismissing them. And he doesn't even believe that people like me deserve human rights, civil rights, or democracy, because he believed that those incredible American values are unique to the American people, but Middle Easterners, and you can see this, Middle Easterners basically need a strong ruler to rule them. And we need to protect people who look like Americans, which is in this case, Israel. You know who say these things? His top advisors at the White House. Those are the people who Biden, surrounded himself with. His top advisor at the look at the Middle East, think, oh, this is a source of instability, but resources, we need to get the resources. And
Who's, you're not speaking about Jake Sullivan. Who are you speaking about?
I'm talking about, his top advisors are three, basically, regarding the Middle East. One of them is Jake Sullivan, no doubt. The other one, I believe, is the Secretary of State, Blinken. But not only that, the most important one and the most hideous one is Brett McGurk.
He ran the ISIS coalition under Trump, I believe, and Obama, I think, right?
He worked with George W. Bush.
Okay.
During the height of the Iraq War. He worked with I believe, with Obama as well for a period. But his whole philosophy is truly colonial, racist, old school, that Arabs and Muslims and brown people don't understand democracy, don't respect democracy, don't deserve democracy, and thus it's better to have dictators that rule them. So he gave carte blanche to the Israelis to do whatever they want. And for him, humanitarian international law doesn't apply to us.
Well, I'm familiar with Brett McGurk. I do think Blinken has a different view, and I think that there's been more. I know it's just talk. I know it's just words in a way that is frustrating for many people, but there's been more talk from this administration about the two-state solution in the last 2 months than there has been in the last 10 years from or Trump.
Empty talks while you're bypassing Congress and giving weapons means nothing. Empty talk while you are violating human rights and vetoing UN resolution to stop the massacre of children is an empty talk and talking point. Empty talk about two-state solution that you know is being dismantled on the ground while you're preventing and pressuring country like Switzerland and others to protect and shield Israel from accountability and from charges of war crimes tells you who they are. When people tell you who they are, believe them. You know what I believe? I believe Biden when he sent weapons. I believe this administration when they tried to veto UN resolution that stopped the killing of thousands of children. 10,000 children were killed. 20,000 people were killed in the span of 83 days. What more need to happen before we understand that Biden policy will backlash on Americans? He's jeopardizing America's national security. He's endangering America's life because you know what's happening? Now America is bombing around the Middle East. It's bombing in Iraq. Their military base been kicked out from Iraq. They're bombing inside Syria. They're now engaging with the Houthis. America is heading towards another war in the Middle East. And that's thanks to that policy of aiding and abetting the genocidal intent of the Israeli right-wing government. I mean, at a certain point, we need to stop telling Biden, oh, he's trying privately. I don't care about what you are doing privately, because what he's doing publicly is harmful and shameful and dangerous.
So I don't disagree at all that for many people, and it's not an invalid perspective, that as definitely it's hard to say it doesn't look like that right now. I have two questions, one about the UN resolution and one about the future. With the UN resolution, the way I've looked at this, because I've followed Bibi for too long, I feel like, let's say that the United States didn't veto a watered down resolution recently, but let's say they didn't veto some of the earlier resolutions. The UN Security Council passes a resolution, the US abstains, maybe they even vote for it, and they say ceasefire now. And Israel says, you're the UN, you can't make us do anything, we don't care. And in order to demonstrate that they don't have to listen to the UN, they actually ramp up attacks and they keep going. I feel like that would have been the outcome. And I feel like the Biden administration then loses more credibility even with Israel, because again, they're trying to play this longer range game, because Bibi's I do not think he survives this. I do not think at some point, either during the war or shortly after, the people clearly want him out of power, and they're just waiting for what they feel will be the right time. I don't think winning the war against Hamas would change his numbers dramatically. They blame him for it happening in the first place. So with Bibi gone, right, if the U.S. hadn't allowed these resolutions to happen right away in the beginning, I think Biden has a different challenge when he goes to the Knesset and speaks to a post-Bibi Israeli parliament and the Israeli public live on Israeli TV.
How many are we willing to sacrifice before Biden delusional policy can start taking place? 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million? I just want to cite a historical fact to depict another Republican president. President Reagan, 1982, when Israel invaded and bombarded and did savagery in Lebanon, he basically was so abhorred by the violence that is nothing compared to what they are doing in Gaza. He called Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and threatened him. He expressed outrage and threatened him to withdraw US support. You know, we had a ceasefire 30 minutes after the end of that call. I don't believe that Biden have no leverage. Biden has no problem with the killing of Palestinian civilians. This is his war as much as Bibi's war. To try to hide behind rhetoric that he cares about civilians, I do not care. I do not believe he cares about Palestinian civilians. He has empathy for everybody else except Palestinians. He does not believe we deserve humanitarian international law. He sees us as subhuman. He sees us precisely the same way Ben Gvir sees us. He sees us as a problem, as an existential problem, and he is fine if we are exterminated as Palestinians. This is the hard truth that the Middle East understand. Because when you look at what he did for Ukrainians, and I supported his policies for Ukrainians, I actually praised him for his policies. And when he said that no people, no nation should live under military occupation. No nation should be brutalized, terrorized by a foreign nation. No one should be subjugated and ethnically cleansed. Guess what? We all supported President Biden because he convinced the world that there's rule-based international order, that international rules need to apply. When it comes to Palestinian, he turns around and says, never mind. These rules can be crushed, can be destroyed, obliterated, because what matters is Israel ethno-nationalism, an ethno-nationalism that is enshrining Jewish supremacy and telling Palestinians that this land belongs only to them. You have people bragging on national television that they went to wiped out Gaza so they can have Israeli settlement inside Gaza. So settlers, colonial settlers, foreigners can come there and see the sea because they have a romantic attachment to the sea and to the water and to the land. And this is happening under Biden. This is on Biden. This is who he is. He needs to own his foreign policy. This is how the world sees it, Brian. We need to be clear about how South Africa, the global South, the Middle East, the world, even Europeans, and I talked to a lot of Europeans, they're horrified. They think he did more damage than Donald Trump did to the cause of democracy, because this will embolden fascists, dictators around the world who will look at this example, this precedent, this catastrophe in Gaza and say, we can implement this somewhere else. And if America dares to open their mouth and lecture us about democracy and human rights and international law, we will tell them, if Israel got away with it, we all want to get away with it. And this is what he is doing to his own legacy, to America's standing. But also in the meantime, I believe that Israelis themselves will take the Gaza model, will start implementing it in the West Bank, Brian. What we are not looking at the big picture.
I do want to talk about the West Bank, but before we get to the West Bank, I do want to make a couple quick points. I think you made a lot of very good points just now. In terms of Menachem Begin and Reagan, I think that the relationship with Israel and the U.S. was very, very different back then, and the United States had, I think, a lot more leverage then than it does now. Not that it doesn't, but I think the U.S. clearly has been trying. They've spent most of their time, and I completely respect what you're saying, is that words, we want to see deeds. And I'm going to stick to my point. I know it's hard for people to believe it, and especially the rest of the world. There's very few people that believe this. I do think that Biden's strategy is to gain the leverage now to use when the war gets even worse, and to use when the war's over to keep the Israelis from going back into Gaza and to make progress towards a Palestinian state. So my question for you is, let's say, because I might be wrong. I might be wrong with the way this is going to go. But let's just say a year from now, let's say in November or October 2024. Let's say the war.
Be nobody. Just to be clear, if this war goes on for another 6 months, there will be nobody. If the rate of the killing continue to be the same way as it is, we are already seeing people who 500,000 people are at risk of starvation and death by starvation. Diseases are rampant in Gaza. Israeli soldiers themselves caught some fungus and they're now hospitalized, and because you have diseases, you have no medication, you have bacteria and fungus that are resistant to antibiotics, you have a humanitarian catastrophe. And I covered the war in Yemen, and believe me, it was horrific. It is nothing compared to what's happening now. You have a besieged population that is, famished.
The food programs, it's worse than North Korea. The famine level is worse than the famines in North Korea in the past few decades.
And this is, so the trickle of aid that Biden is getting to manage to get there and there, so not all of them will starve to death, is pathetic.
I think right now it's pathetic. But what I'm saying is, let's say in November, right?
America is the strongest army in the world.
I'm not trying to cut you off. I'm just trying to have a back and forth here. So what I'm saying is that maybe I'm wrong. And the thing is, I'll be honest and disclose that I interned for Biden a long time ago. Maybe that makes me biased. And I have disagreed with him in some big ways in the past. But let's say that a year from now, right? Let's say that the war ended 2 months from now or 3 months from now, and that was it. That after you and I had this conversation, in the next few weeks and months, way more aid, especially in the next 2 weeks, way more aid got in. The Israeli army did tone down the level and scale of their attacks. Mass displacement outside of Gaza was avoided. Netanyahu is out of power, and there's already preliminary agreements about moving forward on a two-state solution, and the Palestinian Authority is starting to appear inside Gaza, and aid money is already going to rebuild. Would you think differently about Biden's strategy? If maybe it's a fantasy and it'll never happen, and maybe it will. If that's the situation a year from now, will you look back and say some horrible things happened? I wish more had been stopped earlier, but we hit a nadir. Things are bouncing back, and Biden was able to use this leverage to get a better outcome than would have happened otherwise. Is that something that, if that's the way the situation is on the ground, would that be something you would consider thinking, or you're convinced it was absolutely not going to happen?
I was one of the few journalists that predicted Trump victory in 2015, not op-ed in the Washington Post, because I look at the reality for what it is, not what I want it to be. This is what, and if I can make a prediction of what's going to happen, what you're talking about is a fantasy, Sam, and I'm sorry to say that. This is what's going to happen. The war will be escalating towards the north. There will be skirmishes with Hezbollah. The army is itching, Israeli army, to actually attack more Lebanese territories. Biden is already bombing inside Syria and bombing in Iraq and having to deal with the Houthi. They will be invited to another war in the Middle East. I believe Palestinians will be exterminated in Gaza at a huge numbers, large number, much more than we think. I wouldn't be surprised in the next couple of months, the West Bank will blow up completely, and you will have a real attacks against Israelis, and then the world will start thinking, oh my God, we might have Hamas even in the West Bank. They killed 300 Palestinians in the last 80 days, but the world is indifferent to the killing and the violence against Palestinians or the settlers. But as soon as we will see one attack against the Israelis, then another operation will be taking place in the West Bank, and you will see the same kind of atrocities taking place in Gaza, taking also place in the West Bank, and you will see Israelis who normalize the idea of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, demanding from their government to truly ethnically cleanse Palestinians, not only from Gaza, but also from the West Bank.
I want to get into the West Bank with you, and just to wrap this part up, I'll just say I'm sorry that we don't.
On one note, I think you will see America isolated completely internationally, and you will see America discredited completely internationally. Then when they call certain countries to help them in the next phase, probably they will be told, we told you so, no thank you and no thank you, this is your hot potato, deal with it. They will not bail them out, except countries that will be forced to bail them out. And my worst fear, it's already radicalizing a lot of people. There will be attacks against the United States itself.
I think those are all possibilities. I hope I'm right, and I hope you're wrong, but you may end up being right. And my view on Biden, on how he's handled this, would dramatically change if there's not significant improvement in the near term. Within a month at most, I want to see the next couple of weeks things to start to get better. And maybe I'm wrong, but if it doesn't happen within the next couple of months, I think you're right that there will be a critical mass. And you're completely right that this is destroying the U.S. reputation around the world. I mean, I'm talking to my friends in Jordan, and I've never heard them speak so strongly. And I was in Jordan, and I was at the protests in Amman, when Trump moved recognized Jerusalem as the capital. And people were upset about that and crying about that. This is a whole nother level. So I agree completely with that. I do hope that there will be some improvement, but we'll have to see what happens. And if you're right, then we really are in a huge dark era, and that is going to cause young people are deserting him in terms of the polls right now. And so if there's not an improvement in the situation in Gaza, that could really jeopardize his reelection, and then that could be Trump as president. And it'd be crazy how all these things are related. And one thing I don't know if we'll have time to get into this later, I really appreciate your voice on calling out fascism for what it is. You have been brave in using that term, but not reckless. You've been fair, but you've used it where others shied away from it. So I appreciate that about your other work. But I think people really have to understand what's going on the West Bank, because Gaza is obviously such a catastrophe right now. If this wasn't happening, the West Bank is in its worst situation since the Second Intifada right now. That's since 2005. That was a long time ago. And almost no attention is being given there. And what bothers me is I feel like the right-wing ministers in the Israeli government are getting away with literal murder or supporting murder there, and all kinds of other bad stuff that there's just not the bandwidth, unfortunately, with the way our media works, that we're not having these in-depth discussions like we're having you and me now. That doesn't happen on TV as much. So please do start telling us about tell us about a little bit of the history of the West Bank, why it is where it is now, and then what's been happening this year up to, since Netanyahu's government came into power again, up to October 7th, and then what's been happening since October 7th.
So thank you for this question. And I think it's an important conversation about the West Bank. But just to conclude my things about Biden, I think he's committing political suicide, that he's unable to question his policies, revise his policies, and he sees this, the lack of support by young people, by minorities, by others as, something that he can manage. Not only he cannot manage, he is single-handedly handing the presidency to Donald Trump. It's his own actions. It's not that we're not going to vote. We're going, probably the overwhelming majority, would be questions like, what do we do if Trump is the alternative and Biden gave us this horrific foreign policy? The overwhelming majority of the people would stay home. And they will stay home because they see the ethno-nationalist project in Israel and his support for that ethno-national project and fascist project. A year ago, on December 29th, exactly a year ago, this far-right government came to power. Bibi Netanyahu with Ben Gvir, with Smotrich, basically.
By the way, our readers know too, Smotrich and Ben Gvir have each been credibly investigated by Israeli authorities for terrorism or offenses related to terrorism. They were literally categorized by Israel's own legal system as terrorists, and at least one of them was on our watch list of people that we would not grant these. And they are running the finance department, which controls the money going. That's Smotrich. That's how the money, Biden is asking them to give them the money that's actually the Palestinians' money to them. And then the national security advisor is Ben Gvir. These people are horrific, and they're driving a lot of Israeli policy. So I just mean, not everybody is as informed as you or me. So it's important that people know who these people are, and that one of them, it was either on one of his first dates, or he took a date, or his wife or someone, to the shrine for Baruch Goldstein, a terrorist who murdered. I've been to the Ibrahim Mosque in Khalil in Hebron, where 29 or 30 something Muslim worshippers were gunned down by a right-wing Israeli settler terrorist. And because the Israelis they're not wrong to point out when people glorify terrorism from Hamas and other Palestinian and Islamic radical groups. You have Israelis who worship literally a statue of a Jewish terrorist who gunned down innocent Palestinians worshiping in a mosque. And then there's a political party that's based around that ideology, the Kahanists, and then they got outlawed. And then the resurrected version of that is one of these guys' parties, and they're running the government with Bibi Netanyahu. So when people talk about terrorism, and then Begin was elected, he was the head of the IZL. And Sharon was accused of war crimes. He was elected prime minister. So it works both ways. The Israelis have empowered terrorists and war criminals and some of the very worst in their own society, but they're only pointing a finger at Palestinians and say, oh, well, Arafat did this and Hamas did that. And I'm not equating Hamas with Netanyahu. I'm simply saying the reality, and that people have to understand that Israel has had extremists on and off running the government going back many years.
Look, Israel has been occupying the West Bank since 1967, the occupied territories. When they did the Oslo agreement, the whole agreement was they will have a civil government led by the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, but they will slowly start to withdraw from Palestinian territories, and they will negotiate further, giving the control of areas and Palestinian cities. That never happened. The occupation, Oslo was used as a veneer to entrench and consolidate military occupation. The number of settlements went from 60 in 1993 to 200 in 2002 when the second Intifada erupted. The military occupation is the root of all violence. Hamas came to power in '86. So people who said, if we get rid of Hamas, maybe Palestine will get something, they don't understand there was never, Hamas came to power and later they controlled Gaza, but they never controlled the West Bank. And yet the occupied territory in the West Bank is still under military occupation, is still being repressed and abused, and people still being denied basic human and civil rights.
The Palestinian Authority recognized Israel's right to exist as a state. They formally recognized Israel decades ago.
Not only they cooperate on security-wise with Israel, and the whole mantra of why keep Hamas in power, that was Bibi Netanyahu's strategy to divide Palestinians and
Talk about this. Yes, this is so important for people to know.
For Americans, especially American Jews, to understand, who are scared, rightly so, of what's happening, to understand that the man today at the head of Israel who intensify the settlement building and believe in the settlements in the occupied territories, not in Israel, but in the occupied territories, that consolidated the occupation and strengthened the occupation and brought fascists, real fascists, into government, is the same guy that used to say to his people, well, Hamas is an asset in order to torpedo the establishment of Palestinian state. He's the same guy today who's saying to the Americans, give me billions of dollars so that I can continue to perpetrate and repeat the same failed policies that produce nothing except death and destruction. He's telling the Americans, give me the money so I can exterminate the Palestinians, eradicate the Palestinians, not Hamas, Palestinians, and make in a way where only Jews can live in this land. And
I want you to continue real quick. I just want to pause to bring up something real quick, and then I want you to continue with the point you're making. You know, you use the term fascist, and I actually think that that is fair in terms of this government and these people. I think Donald Trump's a fascist. I'm not shy about saying that at all. And I appreciate that you didn't say Nazi, because a lot of people are calling the Israelis, and for many years, way before, the Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu trio. And I've always found that calling the Israeli government or Israel Nazi, or Jews Nazis or Israeli Nazis, I feel like that's wildly counterproductive, and whatever good point you're making, it's lost with that. And I appreciate that you were using the term fascist in that sense, but you didn't. Can you speak to what you think the effect is when people are calling Netanyahu Nazi or Israel Nazi?
And honestly, it's when I for me, it's just, I'm looking at the policies, and my role is to examine the policies and not what people really are saying, because what matters is today the scale of the catastrophe, the humanitarian catastrophe.
I'm making the point that you are careful with your word choice, that I think in a way a lot of other people.
It's not about being careful. It's about accurately describing a reality for what it is. My job is to analyze, examine policy.
Accurate. You're not just using loaded terms for the sake of using loaded terms to get a reaction. You are very measured with your language. And when you use a term that carries a lot of weight, it's because, for me, the situation merits that level of concern. You're not careless with your language. So I appreciate that about you. And I appreciate how you've always been careful about the way you discuss topics and present them, because you've also, as you mentioned before, and I definitely want to get back to West Bank, but I've heard you mention on TV that you have Christians and Jews in your family, that you have Arabs and Muslims in your family, and that you have Israeli citizenship, you know people in Israel. You were also horrified by what happened on October 7th. You don't reserve your compassion and your sorrow for just one side. You've acknowledged these things are terrible. And I just think it's, I feel like you discussed this in a way that's very, very productive, or in a way that I think a lot of other people that mean well maybe don't. Can you speak just very briefly, because I do want to focus on the West Bank, just to the fact that you know people from different backgrounds in your family on this?
Look, even if I didn't have a family who was multi-ethnic, multiracial, and also multi-religious, I really believe as a human being as a woman that if we need to call out human rights violators, we should not look at the identity of the perpetrator to decide if these are human rights violations or not. We need to look at the facts, regardless of who are the violators and perpetrators are. If you care about human rights only when the enemy commits them, then you really don't care about human rights violations or international law. And I think the universality of those values are very important to me. I would be the first one to protest if my Jewish brother and sister are repressed and oppressed. I would be the first one to protest if Europeans or Americans or Africans, for me, their identity is irrelevant to the principle that we all are born free and equal and deserving of the protection of the law. And we all deserve to be free and live as free human beings. In the 21st century, to think that there's this ethno-national system where people are superior racially and or inferior is maddening. That the fact that we did not learn nothing from slavery or from apartheid South Africa or from the Holocaust itself. I mean, I grew up in Jerusalem, but also I studied in Europe. I studied in Italy. I mean, Primo Levi, his book, If This Is a Man, about how European Jews were treated, shaped the way I view also my own homeland. I mean, when I listen to Donald Trump talking to American Jews, indicating that they are disloyal because they are not loyal enough to Israel and somehow, and then thinking that he is the most pro-Israeli president according to the Israelis, there's something really wrong with that narrative. And the man that ran to office, which is Joe Biden, when he saw those people in Charlottesville protesting, saying, blood and soil, Jews will not replace it. He's the same man is enabling ethno-national in Israel. And also at the White House where he said, oh, we need Israel because Jews can be safe. These are American Jews should be safe everywhere, regardless the policy that Israel is carrying out. They should not be
in the US right now, right? You're teaching in Miami?
I am teaching in Miami.
So it's amazing to me, and it's so heartbreaking. What's happening over in the Middle East is heartbreaking enough. There are both Jews and Arabs who have been killed in the United States because of what's happening over there. I just, that there are Jews and Muslims who feel unsafe in America. It breaks my heart.
But this is part of the dehumanization, Brian. We dehumanize Palestinians to such an extent that when officials call them subhuman and animals and criminals, and there's no pushback but our media, and they normalize the language, but they normalize also the whole idea that we are not deserving of human rights. We are not deserving. We don't deserve to be free. We don't deserve to be safe. I mean, I have so many friends who are getting death threats and rape threats regularly, simply for speaking on television, for giving those 2 minutes. And they've always been put in a defensive position where they have to justify the acts instead of explaining how we got here and how we get out of here. We are called as Palestinians only to justify our existence, while state propaganda from the Israeli part is normalized and used in a way as if those are facts. I mean, this is.
I got so emotional when Rashida Tlaib was speaking in Congress and she was being censured, and she came to tears. Do I agree with her use of the phrase "from the river to the sea"? No. Do I think she meant it in a genocidal way? No. Do some people who use that phrase mean it that way? Yes. Is that why she shouldn't have used it? Yes. But she should. She has all this pressure. She's the only Palestinian out of 435 voting members of Congress. She's the only one, and she feels such a pressure to represent her people and speak out. And it's not just a lot of those people, it may not have passed, but a lot of those people who voted to censure her would have been out the river to the sea statement just because she's standing up for Palestinians. And for her to be treated that way, she is such a burden on her, and it's so hard to speak out to institutions. For Palestinians, on campuses you can do it, but if you do it on the regular media, if you do it in other things, there is a lot of pushback sometimes. There is a bit of a double standard, but it's changing with the younger generation.
I understand, but when that official, I think a congressman, said that they will turn Gaza in a parking lot, he was not censored.
That was worse. To me, that is even worse.
In the genocidal talk. when Israeli officials talk about from the river of the sea, it will be only free, and Jews the only one who will be free. They're not censored. Nobody is calling them out on American media.
Charter. It's paraphrased, but it's in the Likud charter.
To call them. I mean, when I go in American media and any of these networks, and when I talk to the producer, I could see fear and hear fear in their voice. And they call me before, they ask me what I'm going to say precisely, because they're terrified that anything I might say might hurt the sensibility of certain people and other groups. I mean, this is not journalism. The truth has to be unfiltered, and we need to tell our people the truth, because this is how you save democracy. This is how you shake this White House of their delusion that somehow their policies will produce anything except mass radicalization and destruction and more wars. I mean, I am sure and confident when the White House official who stood at the podium and said, well, Hamas is not releasing the women because they might be raped and they are scared in captivity and they are scared that they will talk about the rape. The idea came out and said, please don't say these things. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, when your IDF have to be correcting you, you understand that you've gone too far with your propaganda. You have to, the truth matter for democracy. Facts matter for democracy. Without truth and facts, you don't have democracy anymore. And if you can claim those things when it comes to Donald Trump, why cannot you claim the same things? And keep your policies and reality rooted in facts and truth when it comes to Israel.
Reading this year and last year, I've been reading about George Orwell, and I think he would be proud to have known you, because he didn't care what side it was coming from, whether it was quote unquote his side, the socialist, communist, or the other side. He called out that type of stuff from all angles, and I do. I really do appreciate, because I'm not saying that I feel like you need to do this for me, but I just want my audience to know more about you and who you are and where you stand, because I've heard you condemn Hamas for years. You're not pro-Hamas. People just assume if you speak up for the Palestinians that you're pro-Hamas these days, which is nuts. And at the same time, I've been engaging in these Twitter spaces, which frankly are beneath your dignity, but a lot of the people in there that are speaking on behalf of Palestinians, they may not even be Palestinian, they may be diaspora, not actually living in the West Bank or Gaza. That doesn't invalidate their voices, but they're focused on talking about Hamas didn't actually rape anybody because they're good Muslims. An Israeli helicopter killed all those people at the festival. That's a fact. The Hamas didn't target any civilians, and they're debating these things. And they're not talking about the mass bombardment. They're not talking about the starvation nearly as much. They're focused on these things that are, if not just completely wrong, at least highly questionable or extremely debatable. I think what's happening on the ground in Gaza, the way you're framing it, is not that debatable, and it's pretty clear. And I just appreciate that you're focused. Not so many people get trapped in these crazy talking points, and I've always found you, even if I don't fully agree with you, I've always found you to be very grounded. And I just appreciate the way that you approach this subject, because it's so much conspiracy theories and craziness from both sides on this. And it's so depressing to have to listen to these people denying that Hamas even killed people. And I know that you were horrified by what happened on October 7th. And I can only imagine, because like you understand Israel, like me, and I knew that what was going to come in response to that was awful. But I also, in that moment, was just heartbroken for what was happening to those people in those kibbutzniks, who are the most liberal pro-Palestine. That Hamas attacked them of all. Not that they should attack right-wingers and not left-wingers. That's stupid. But the fact that they attacked those people who were so committed against Netanyahu and committed to a two-state solution, it was heartbreaking.
So regarding killing of civilians, using rape as a weapon of war, look, the killing of civilians is always wrong. It's always a war crime. And when Israel came out and laid the facts of what happened exactly, and then, in fairness, they revised some of the data. They said it's 1,200 who died, 200, actually, I believe Mark Regev admitted it on Mahdi Hassan's show, saying
1,500 down to 1,200.
To 1,200. I think that was an important fact. I think we have multiple investigations that revealed what Hamas did, the extent that some of the people were militaries, but there is also civilians, and we need to acknowledge that killing civilians is a war crime. and needs to be denounced as a war crime. Regarding the rape campaign, and Brian, I am the daughter of a woman who was raped herself.
And at some point I read about what happened to your mother, and that's also heartbreaking.
Covered the rape campaign in Syria. I covered the rape campaign in Ukraine.
And it's the pro-Assad people trying to defend the Palestinians now.
So, and I think it's very important always when it comes to use of rape as a weapon of war, it's very important to listen to the survivor, document the facts, and give them justice. One of the reasons why for me it's very important, but I guess I noticed working with rape survivors throughout for decades, I realized that for them justice is accountability. And I was stunned when the Israelis, when the United Nations Human Rights Commission started an investigation, and some of the Israelis were attacking them. It's like, oh no, don't investigate us, and you're anti-Semitic. I find it ridiculous, and I find it really also an injustice to the survivors themselves, that I think they want justice. They want accountability, and accountability it's not the mass killing of people. You want real justice. You want to bring these people before court so they can be persecuted and prosecuted. And you know how I know this? When I work with the Ukrainians.
And Amal Clooney have spoken very eloquently about this, how it's not just good enough to kill them, they'd rather have them tried.
Yes. And Nadia Murad and I worked during the G7 on the whole issue of accountability and why it's important. But for us, and especially people who've been advocate for women's rights, and especially survivors' right of rape campaigns, whether used in Bosnia or in Ukraine or in Syria, the most important element is to have an international bodies, independent investigate. And when I hear people try to say, oh, the UN women are not denouncing fast enough and the UN is not doing fast enough. Well, I just want to say that it takes time to gather these evidence, to have these witnesses not traumatized. Initially there are too traumatized that want to talk about that. There's a shame issue. There's an issue connected with stigma.
But where's the video? Like, they're not going to publish a video, even if there is.
Videos, but you have evidence that you can collect, and you can collect them, and you can have eyewitnesses, and the women themselves, the survivors. So when we had witnesses from Ukraine who crossed the border and came to Poland, and they were interviewed months after what happened. So you don't have DNA, you don't have other. However, the location was important, the place, all the elements were consistent. And that's why I believe that there was an arrest warrant that was sent to multiple officials by the ICC. That's why Putin was the deportation of children. So all of it helped build the case. In the case of Yugoslavia was the same. In the case of Rwanda was the same. But it took months and months because you want the evidence to be solid rock before you deposit these evidence in any venue, in any international venue. I think Israel is not served well by the UN ambassador and others, officials who.
Israelis who can't stand him. That thing with the star, that was a joke. He said there's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Also, other journalists, especially some on CNN, who basically wrap themselves with this issue with sexual violence, that somehow they use it to attack feminists and activists and UN. I find that really.
Say, oh, how can you be gay in Gaza? Like, that's not the issue here. Like, that's such a cheap, weird attack. No, it's hard to be gay in Gaza, but we're talking about occupation and war right now. We're talking about rape.
Being exterminated at a rate that you cannot be a child in Gaza. You cannot be a pregnant woman in Gaza. You cannot be an elderly in Gaza. You cannot be an Israeli hostage who runs shirtless with white flag and not be killed in Gaza. We have to understand the magnitude of the atrocity we're looking at.
In that situation, if they killed 3 of their own civilians, their own citizens, that were shirtless with no weapons and waving a white flag, the first thought, other than, my God, how sad for them, 2 Jews and 1 Muslim together. It was so sad. And I thought to myself, how many times has this happened to Palestinians where we don't even hear about it? and they're like, oh, those are 3 men of military fighting age. They must have been Hamas or something, whatever it is. Like, we don't know. We'll never really know. But there must have been so many other people that met that fate, and we're just not told about it because they weren't Israeli citizens. And if those 3 men had been not Israeli citizens, I don't think we need to have any of the specific information about their fates. They would just be bodies put in a mass grave.
An entire family was wiped out, 70 people, Christmas Day. And Israel today admitted they used the wrong weapons, the wrong ammunition. They wiped out an entire family on Christmas Day because, according to them, they used the wrong ammunition. But then we have one.
Even like, how do you use the wrong? You either are using the right bomb, like it's a 2,000-pound bomb, or a 500-pound bomb, or it's artillery, or like I don't understand. Like I understand accidentally bombing a target. How you have the wrong?
There's total disregard for the sanctity of life, for human life. The killing fields in Gaza, as UN officials said, it's worse than the one that we saw in Cambodia. It's worse than the one that we saw in probably that we saw in Bosnia. And we're looking at, look, Brian, by the time the dust will settle, I thought at the beginning of the war, maybe 100,000 would be killed. I believe the number would be much bigger, much bigger. I believe.
You're right. I really hope you're not, and I hope. I just don't. I want to talk about the figures because there's the 20. Israel keeps bringing this up that it's the Hamas health ministry. You can't trust their numbers, but then report after report has shown that the numbers coming from the officials under the Gaza is run by Hamas. This is a health ministry. They're not necessarily gung-ho Hamas people. They're just there as health people, most of them, not all of them. Some militants are running hospitals or whatever, but these are basically health officials, and their numbers have been corroborated in the past by 8 organizations, by the UN, and by the IDF itself. When they release their estimates, they're quite close to these numbers. So there's nothing. There was some crazy stuff about Al-Aqsa Hospital, and then they brought the number down. So, but overall, day in, day out, they have proven to be credible over time. And they've already said 20,000. But the point I want to make about that is that when Israel then says 2-1, 8,000 Hamas, the health ministry officials are not counting Hamas bodies on the battlefield. They're not on the battlefield where the IDF is operating, going thereafter and counting them. Almost all the bodies they're encountering are the civilians being killed outside of the battle zone. So that it's not inclusive. The 20,000 isn't inclusive of all of the Hamas casualties, right? So it's actually much larger if you include Hamas. And then there's all the people buried under the rubble that they can't get to. They said it's probably thousands more. And every reporter that's been there says, oh my God, the stench of death. And this reminds me of Tom Friedman's account of the Hama massacre, when Hafiz Assad was proud to show the world, I massacred this entire city in 1982. And he brought the international press to show everyone, this is what I do when people stand up to me. And he talked about the stench of death because they've been there for days or weeks. I don't remember how long, but they were decomposing and rotting under the rubble. And that's what people are smelling now in Gaza. So this poo-pooing of the 20,000 number, it's, and I think someone told Biden something bad. I know you have a different view of him on this than I do. I think if he looks back on what he's learned since then, he probably regrets saying that statement about questioning the death toll. But I get very upset when people try to minimize the level of death because it's clearly horrific.
What we're looking at, a level of death that I think much larger than 100,000. I believe by the time we discover there will be
so far by the end of the war.
If you look at also the aerial footage from above, you see that large chunks of northern Gaza destroyed completely. Not everybody left. We believe 500,000 people stayed. I don't know how many are under the rubble, but the 20,000, and I believe that the ministry stopped even counting. They're unable to count. The soldiers, the IDF released 80 bodies the other day of people. They were buried all together in mass graves. Gaza is now turning in a large mass grave. Every hospital is a mass grave. Every park, every place, there's basically bodies everywhere.
So up to this point, you think it's 100,000 as of now, or it's going to get to 100,000?
I think it will exceed 100,000.
But not yet. You don't think it's gotten there yet?
I don't know. I wouldn't. I wouldn't go past the fact that we're already at 100,000 under the rubble. And not only that, I believe in the next, we will start seeing people dropping dead because of starvation and diseases. I believe that this is a deliberate strategy to basically the shock and awe between massive bombardment, starvation, diseases. So they cannot say that they died by directly by Israeli actions, except South Africa today approached the International Criminal Court with respect to act committed by Israel in the context of their attack in Gaza, and they called to investigate the commitment of war crimes. South Africa today, they did it just today. They talked about, crimes against humanity, war crimes. They mentioned that we reached the threshold of genocide, and they relate the crimes that, they talk directly of the 1948 convention punishing of genocide. And when you ask President Biden, he thinks that this is somehow will make Israeli safe, or this is somehow will guarantee Israeli safety. This will unleash a level of violence we've never seen before. Violence breeds violence. If by the end of the war, you will look at Hamas situation or Aleppo or Grozny, where you have leveled an entire city.
You were in Grozny in the 90s, right? Or the 2000s?
I was, and I entered Syria, and I covered also the war in Syria for the New York Times in 2017. I entered areas from the north, Gaziantep, through Gaziantep to Jebreal and Bab Shams, and I saw what Assad and Putin did there. And
I've been to Match a long time ago, but I've been to Match al-Shams when I was studying abroad in Israel and in Palestine.
And I remember very clearly, like seeing the devastation. But compared to everything I've seen in my covering wars, whether it's the Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, nothing. I never seen anything like this. The magnitude of the mass slaughter is something that is truly unique to Gaza.
Have you also been to Aleppo, or you didn't make it to
I never made it to Aleppo.
Okay. So you have been to Grozny. So, but people want, Grozny is the capital of the republic within the Russian Federation, the Republic of Chechnya.
Yes.
It's part of Russia, but there was 2 wars there that were horrific, and Putin essentially obliterated the whole city. It was a much, much smaller city and meant far fewer people than what's going on in Gaza. So I think what you're saying, it's worse in Gaza because there's so many more people involved, correct?
Because it's a caged city. It's like it's a killing cage.
People can actually get out of Grozny. They can't get out of Gaza.
They cannot get out. They're being starved at
Aleppo, and it was horrific in all those places, and in Mosul. Very bad situation, but most of the civilians were able to leave. Well, no one has been able to leave except for a handful of sick and injured people a couple of weeks ago or a month ago. But that's no other Palestinians have gotten out of, a couple of people that work for media organizations, but it's been, I don't think even 100 Palestinians have gotten out since this began.
But not only that, they're not able to leave, and there's no safe zone anywhere because they've been bombing even the safe zone. And they've been dropping a level of bombs, the kind of, the bombardment, the indiscriminate bombing. It's like they've been dropping bombs that the United States dropped on Iraq and Afghanistan in years.
Yeah. And when even Biden to donors said it was indiscriminate. And so I want you to talk, because there are people who are defending the IDF's conduct. Like for me, I think Israel has the right to try to take out Hamas, but to do so in a way that is far more humane and I think they should, if honestly, I know it sounds crazy, but if I was running Israel, I would have said, I would have created UN camps inside Israeli territory, because we're not going to, the whole problem with Egypt is because of the displacements in the past into Lebanon, into Syria, and into Jordan, and those people were never allowed back. There's no way Egypt could take in people like that, because they can't trust that Israel would ever let them back in, and it would be a repeat of 48 and 67. But if you allow these people to set up camps that were set up, run inside by the PA, but also by the UN, and allowed them to evacuate before Israel went in, before Israel bombarded, and then what happens is those people are safe, they're taken care of, and then Israel doesn't want them on Israeli territory. So as soon as the war is over, they want them back in Gaza as soon as possible. If they're in Egypt, they're going to say, oh, that problem solved, now they're gone, and they're not going to want them to come back. But if they were in Israeli territory, and the fact that they didn't allow any of these people, even if it was just women and children, to evacuate. But no one's been allowed to evacuate. And then they tell them evacuate to these parts of Gaza, and then they bomb them there. And then the people are saying this is the most humane army in the world. Like, look, the U.S. made a lot of mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan and the ISIS coalition, but by and large, they often took a lot of measures and they got better over time, except under Trump, they regressed a bit. But they got, especially once Petraeus took over and Gates took over, the priority was protecting Iraqi civilians. And it doesn't absolve us for our responsibility for the way this happened, but the vast majority of Iraqi civilians were killed by foreign terrorist sectarian militias, not directly by U.S. bombs and directly by U.S. troops. But we still created those conditions that allowed that to happen. All these people are dying from direct Israeli action, or we didn't cut off medicine and water to a whole city. Like, we never did that in these situations. So people are trying to say that they're even more moral than the U.S. military. I just don't see that. Am I crazy, or am I missing something?
No, look, in my entire career covering wars after war, I never seen a scale of slaughter.
By the way, your entire career, and because you've said this out loud, so I hope you're not offended. But you said this out loud. My jaw dropped because I couldn't believe it. You are 50. I never would have guessed ever. I mean, you and JLo was come up with a business together for how people to avoid looking how old they are, because I would never have guessed you're that old. But you have been around for many years covering this stuff. Like, this is not something, you're not like 22, you just started doing this for 4 or 5 years. You're 50, which again, I'm sorry, I just can't, it's hard to believe, but you're 50 and very accomplished and experienced. So when you say this out of my whole career, this is not just some for someone who maybe is watching a low resolution, this isn't just some young woman who just started reporting. She's an experienced reporter who's been on this planet for half a century.
Look, I started my career in Iraq 2003 officially. Obviously, I covered the Bosnia War, but the scale of the slaughter in Gaza is the worst I ever seen in my long career, second only to Rwanda and Bosnia, and that says a lot.
Rwanda too?
Sorry?
You covered Rwanda? You went there?
Rwanda, but I study as a scholar who teaches propaganda and genocide. So, and obviously I watch a lot of, working with war crime units who collect evidence for international criminal courts. We watch a lot of evidence so we could, hardcore evidence so we could relate these evidence, especially when it comes to Syria and Ukraine, to others. So, Rwanda was an example to study and analyze. What's most disturbing for me here when it comes to Gaza, which I don't think will end up in Gaza. It's not going to stop in Gaza. It's going to be expanding to the West Bank. The same approach of mass killing of civilians. Israel is not only getting away with mass killing, it's getting away with enshrining in international law and to the international community the idea that they are the only victim and they are doing this to survive. This is a nuclear state power, nuclear country that has 500 nuclear bombs. Yet they look at America's experience in the Middle East, especially Iraq. Americans came to terms with its own mistakes in Iraq. They waged war.
He told them, don't make the same mistakes that we made after that. He did that. They were unhappy with him. He did say that.
The problem with Biden, he can talk he don't do the same mistake, but I will give you weapons regardless. I will give you weapons without any red lines. I will give you weapons if you start people on bomb hospital. I will give you weapons, bypass Congress, even when you bomb schools and churches, and even when you bomb, civilian population. He is not telling them, look, my friends, I'm willing to help you if you implement our strategy, especially the surge and the Sahwa in Iraq that we handled, we dealt with extremists. The whole surge idea in Iraq was not a military surge. There's no military solution to the situation. It was a surge of ideas. You just read General Petraeus' last book, Conflict. He says in Iraq, what they did, they needed to walk back from the bad policies that Bush enacted initially, the de-Baathification. They had to dismantle those policies and tell the Iraqi population, we will end your disenfranchisement. We will end the occupation. We'll give you a better life on one condition. Help us defeat Al-Qaeda. We will not bomb indiscriminately. We will not starve you. We will help you have a better life, freedom, help us against Al-Qaeda. And that's what
Israel has had 56 years to do that. It has not done that. And I will say you, I wrote an article years ago where I compared Petraeus, his philosophy, and I quote from his counterinsurgency manual. I contrasted U.S. coin strategy, counterinsurgency, with Israeli counterinsurgency strategy, and how the U.S. in a few years in Iraq and Afghanistan realized they were making mistakes, they learned from their mistakes, and they improved. And Israel just keeps doing the same thing over and over again for half a century. It's just mind-bogglingly stupid.
Biden with a straight face say, I told my Israeli not to do my strategy, but I will support you even as you do our own mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's something really not coherent about what he's saying. Either he's not thinking or he's delusional. It's like, so he's aiding and abetting Israel in doing the same mistake that led to the surge of extremists in Iraq and Afghanistan, while knowing very well that these policies did not work, that actually backlashed and fired back, and he's supporting them anyway. A real friend of Israel will tell Israelis, look, we know what you're dealing with. We dealt with it before. This is how you do it. And he would send them, some of these generals, to help them. He actually tried, and the generals came back and said, whatever Israel is doing is on them. You cannot say it's on them when you're providing them with weapons and ammunition that they're using to kill thousands of children and civilians.
So I don't disagree. I think there's going to be a change in that soon. I think the limits of the goodwill and the patient, I think there's going to be a change. If I'm wrong, I hope I'm not. If I'm wrong, I will come back and tell you that you were right. There is no change, but I think there will be.
What evidence, what do you see in their narrative and rhetoric that suggests otherwise, that suggests that there will be a change? Because I'm not seeing anything.
I guess it's in the reporting and the way that the words are changing and the way that the frustration is mounting. I think they would have thought that Netanyahu would have responded more positively to our suggestions by now. He clearly isn't. He clearly is telling us things and then not following through. And I think there's a natural amount of patience. I don't know exactly where it is, but I think it's almost exhausted. And I think there will be a shift. If I'm wrong and there's nothing different in a month or 2 months, we should circle back and you can tell me I was wrong and I'll admit it. But I do think there is going to be a change. We'll just have to wait and see. But I respect your skepticism. And I'm talking to my friends who are Palestinian, and almost all of them feel exactly the way you do. And I don't blame them. Biden has a tremendous amount of work to do to push Israel in the right direction and to earn any kind of respect or trust back from whether they're Americans who are Palestinian or Muslim or anybody in the world, Palestinian or Muslim, and other people. We have got a lot to do to earn trust back as America. And if we don't do it, that is going to be on us. So I do agree with a lot of what you've been saying there.
Brian, look, I have no faith anymore that in the ability of this administration to change, because I've seen them doing mistakes that they know there are mistakes, because they did these mistakes in Iraq and they produced nothing except more ISIS. Israelis themselves did the same thing in Lebanon in '82, where they forced the PLO to depart. They betrayed the Palestinians who, after promising the Palestinians would be safe, they committed Sabra Shatila massacre. And now they, out of that invasion, birthed the
Wait, when I brought up General Sharon earlier for my audience, when I brought up Ariel Sharon, who was prime minister for most of the second intifada until Netanyahu or Ehud Olmert took over after him, when he was in a coma, he was sick. He was a very overweight man by this point. This is in the mid 2000s, the late 2000s. He was a general for many years in the Israeli military, and he was operating in refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila, in Lebanon, Palestinian refugee camps. People were displaced since 48 or 67. And the allies of Israel in the Lebanese civil war were the Christian phalangists, fascists, essentially, right-wing Christian militias. And Israel had these camps surrounded, and they basically let the phalangists go in and massacre hundreds of men, women, children, innocent, unarmed civilians in these camps.
3,000 Palestinian civilians, unarmed, were butchered and massacred and killed. So again, out of that
sorry about that.
Story, you have the birth of a bigger threat to Israel, which is Hezbollah, that is still the dominant force on the north of Israel. So again, I mean, even the whole idea to dismantle Hamas, that has a political arm outside of the country.
Sure, they can't they can get rid of their military ability to govern and have military forces in Gaza, but they still exist in their Qatari base. They still have cells in the West Bank. They have cells in Lebanon. You can't completely. It's stupid. But they can
Dismantle the whole idea.
You
Killing civilians. You have to address the underlying cause.
They don't even want to talk about the underlying causes. They refuse to. Netanyahu. I really want to get into this with you. Netanyahu's MO has been, I am not going to work towards a Palestinian state, and I'm going to support Hamas as a counterweight, and this is other Israelis going back to the 80s, as a counterweight to Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority, the party of Yasser Arafat. They run the Palestinian Authority, they run the West Bank. We're not going to reward years of security cooperation that the Israeli generals and Shin Bet and Mossad say has saved Israeli lives. We're not going to reward years of security cooperation, renouncement of violence, and recognition of the state of Israel on the part of Fatah and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. We're not going to reward that. We're actually going to give more resources to Hamas to weaken these other people and Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, and his people, because that way we can say that, oh, look, there's terrorists, we can't work with them, and then they refuse to help the people who, and I've pointed out for years, if they punished Hamas in Gaza and rewarded Fatah in the West Bank by bringing back settlers, by reducing restrictions, by giving them more freedom and self-determination, then you could say, see, if you cooperate with us, good things happen. Instead, they've been given the literal opposite message. If you cooperate with us, you get nothing. Violent resistance might be the only thing that we respond to, because we're certainly not responding in peaceful cooperation. And this has been Netanyahu's strategy for years, and it has absolutely blown up in his face. But is there anything you want to, because I've been trying to point this out, there's all stick and no carrot. What do you expect? You don't have to expect October 7th, but you certainly have to expect violent resistance and terrorism, because that happens in all situations like that throughout the world, including when the British Mandate authorities were occupying the Jewish people in the Yishuv before 1948, including when the Romans did it 2,000 years ago, including the Warsaw Ghetto.
Look, I mean, why I'm skeptical of Biden, because even this week, for the second time in 1 month, he bypassed Congress to approve an emergency weapon sale to Israel. They're using those weapons to kill and starve and bomb to oblivion, not only Gaza, Gazans, children. Again, I am so skeptical, because despite the fact that the Israeli government keep reiterating their goals to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, to depopulate the West Bank and Gaza, to erase the Palestinians, Biden is not only paying lip service, he continues to provide the weapons that continue to butcher thousands of Palestinians. And I am very proud of South Africa and other countries that are taking the lead. They're taking the lead and saying, we want accountability, because we are in this situation because of the lack of accountability, because Israel for so long felt there's total impunity, that they're shielded by the United States, that they can do whatever they want. And I think part of why we have this extreme right-wing government, it is the byproduct of years long under both administration, Democratic and Republican administration, of telling Israel, do whatever you want, violate whatever laws, commit acts of real crimes and war crimes and crimes against humanity. We will defend you regardless. We will arm you, defend you, and bankroll you. You know, some of these millions of dollars that have been approved last week in the Israeli Knesset by Smotrich, 70 million shekel, has been basically given to the settlements, not to the borders.
Right? They were giving them guns, weren't they?
They were giving thousands of guns.
Military-grade guns. They're not supposed to go to them.
So they can kill Palestinians with total impunity, but also more funding, more money. So you and I in America have to pay for our healthcare. Israelis have very free healthcare. They have free, free schools, free healthcare, free everything, free education, because it's bankrolled by the United States. So our tax dollars, pay dollars, goes to bankroll an ethno-religious project of purity and exclusion that see people like me, simply because they have a different race and they have a different faith, as an existential enemy, as an enemy, regardless what we do.
So can We talk a little more about the West Bank and what, because I know we got sidetracked a bit. I think it's very important for the audience to understand what's happening, what was happening before October 7th and the months in this year, and then what's happening now.
So look, before October 7th, in the occupied territories, this administration, the Netanyahu administration, kept building settlements, kept oppressing Palestinians. 250 Palestinians were killed before. This has been the most horrific year. And even before, 5 years before October 7th. After October 7th, another 300 Palestinians were killed in cold blood. There's no Hamas in the West Bank. So if you want to understand Israel's government war on Palestinians, just look no further than the West Bank.
There's a few Hamas cells, but nothing major, right? It's nothing that warrants this level of operation.
I mean, they're not in control of anything. Whatever operation doesn't justify the killing of 300 civilians, including 140 children, including the 8,000 people who were kidnapped, abducted, and are now in Israeli dungeon.
By the way, we also briefly talk about that because I got very offended when there were certain people saying there was the list that Israel released of 350, 350, including Ahid Tamimi. And, you know, people were saying, oh, these are all terrorists. How dare you equate they're terrorists? And I went to the Israeli Ministry of Justice website and I cut and pasted all the Hebrew. It's only in Hebrew, not Arabic, which is ridiculous because these are Arabs. I cut and pasted all of it into Excel. I talked to some of my Israeli friends. I used Google Translate. I talked to some of my Israeli friends about what some of the terms meant. And I found that the vast majority of these people were not accused formally of any crime. They were held under administrative detention. And the vast majority, whether they were in administrative detention or not, were accused of very minor things. At most, stone throwing or assaulting a police officer could just be resisting arrest. There's severe assault of a police officer, which is a different charge. But this is just like tussling with police a little bit, throwing some rocks. That is not someone a terrorist. Or just for incitement or assembly.
But even, look, just to be clear, I have a lot of relatives who live everywhere across the country. Even if you look at the wrong way at a police officer, that can be a death sentence. If you are not complying completely with what he's saying, this is death sentence. If you're driving and you lost your road, you maybe lost direction, this is a death sentence. We live under martial law in an apartheid regime, where our life is determined if we live or we die, depends on how that soldier, he might be 20-year-old.
Or a settler with a gun who's not even a soldier.
The gun. So, I mean, the rule of law, when they say, oh, but there's when Blinken was asked, I believe 2 years ago, where did Palestinians go to for redress? And I think Ilhan Omar asked him this question. He said they should go to Israel. Well, it's like going to the KKK for justice if you're a Black man or a woman in America during Jim Crow. If you are during slavery, if you go to your master, it's like, well, I want justice because your son or your neighbor hurt me. It's ridiculous. The issue of law under occupation, there's no law under occupation. There's no legality. The whole structure is illegal.
Briefly for the audience, you used the term apartheid. So if we're talking about Israel and its 67 borders, I think there's a lot of discrimination and racism. Some of it's even institutionalized. There's a lot of it all over the world. I think you could call most countries in the world apartheid if you call Israel a country in its proper. But the West Bank, I think, is worse than apartheid. I think the West Bank, the West Bank to me is actually worse than what was in South Africa.
No, I don't call most countries racist or apartheid states. I think in the case of Israel,
I'm not saying you are. I was just making to distinguish myself. I don't think. I know you're saying the West Bank's apartheid, but would you agree that Israel itself is not necessarily apartheid?
Not only Gaza. Israel is an apartheid regime where there's especially in the West Bank, in Gaza, and occupied East Jerusalem, where my family also live. It's so enshrined.
You would agree with me that it depends where you're talking about. It's not all of Israel is 100% apartheid. It's the system of governance in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza that's apartheid.
Occupied territories, all the occupied territories, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza.
Okay, so then
and when I talk about an apartheid regime, I'm talking about, and it reminds me of South Africa. I believe South African leader said that it's much worse, and I agree with that statement. But you know, when people look at Israel as like the only democracy and the rule of law. I just
I mean,
want to remind
Canada
them
and Iraq are now democracies. Honestly, they're not perfect, but they're still democracies. I mean, they're
no cross.
dysfunctional, but so is the U.S. these days. You know, but they're democracies too.
They're a democracy for Jews and Jews only. And it's called an ethnocracy, ethno-national state. And in 2018, they enshrined their ethno-nationals in a law that was called a nation-state law, nation-state bill, which says that between the river to the sea, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, Israel is free and self-determination is granted only for Jews and for Jews only.
Which a lot of Israelis, even a lot of Jewish Israelis, disagree with that and were against that. And that was controversial even back then.
It's the law. I just want to remind people that South Africa, apartheid South Africa was legal. Slavery was legal. Sadly, the Holocaust was legal. Legality is an issue of power. It's not an issue of justice. So when they tell us, oh, but whether Israelis agree with it or not, it passed and it's now the law of the land. Jewish supremacy is law of the land, sadly. And I say sadly because you look at the Declaration of Independence of Israel, which talked about equal rights for all the inhabitants, regardless their ethnicity. So this is, a shift, a pivot from what the founding father wanted for Israel.
And I don't want to trivialize this by bringing up this comparison, but by any chance are you a Star Wars fan? Okay, well, there's this line that a character has where it's a very interesting quote. Justice is merely the construct of the current power base. There is no justice, no law, no order except for the one that will replace it. And it's just this brutal line that I think about sometimes because it's really sad that in principle there is international law. In principle, there are rules of justice and law, but then it's so often in practice, justice really is just what the current power structure decides it wants it to be, which is really sad. And I tell my Israeli friends that aren't terribly concerned about the rights of Palestinians, the same international law that means you have a legitimate state means that the Palestinians are an occupied people who deserve their own state.
Sadly, Israel has been moving to the right. And if you look at some of those videos coming out of their media, but also their officials, but also the army, the soldiers, but also regular young people from Israel who are glorifying the violence, calling for more violence, for wiping out Palestinians, for bragging about killing babies. And I look at these videos and it reminds me of a sentence, like there's something deeply rotten in a culture that glorify the death, the mass killing, the violence, the killing of children. We reach a level where we can clearly talk about the fascist trend in Israel.
Sure. I mean, have you seen the HBO Keshet production called Our Boys? You know what I'm talking about?
No.
It was a joint Israeli television network and HBO production where it was called Our Boys and it was about the stuff that happened in 2014. And what people thought it was going to be about was it was going to be about the 3 Israeli teenagers who were kidnapped and murdered by a lone wolf cell that helped lead to the 2014 disaster. What it really was about was right-wing Jewish extremist settlers who burned alive Kadir and killed him. And Israelis were so upset about this because they thought it was going to be about their side and their narrative that they wanted to highlight. And this was an HBO Israeli joint production where they had Arabs, they had Palestinian and Israeli crew, Jewish crew working together. They got the blessing of the family of Mohammed Abu Qadir to say that they basically thought this was a fair presentation of what happened. And they interspersed throughout this the real language of Israeli protesters going through the streets chanting death to Arabs, and of Netanyahu saying this, that, and the other thing, and of the rallies for when they knew they were dead, they still had these rallies for the kids that was getting up even more excitement and trauma. And the way that the social media worked and all this other stuff, and the Shin Bet investigator who's trying to find the truth and ends up calling out and arresting and getting tried the Jewish extremists who did this, he was thought of as a traitor, and right-wing Jews were graffitiing his house and stuff. This is 2014. When you think about we're in 2023, this level of extremism and incitement and the way it plays in the media has been happening, and also in the U.S. The same thing's been happening in the U.S. It's terrifying.
If you look at what happened yesterday, there was a school principal who posted on his social media an article saying we need to pay attention to the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the starvation. I don't know if you saw the video of people attacking him, storming the school and attacking him.
I
But
think it was a woman. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it may have been a woman even, but yeah, I saw that.
And so any debate, in time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. I think George Orwell said that thing. What I hear Israeli media, it reminded me of Rwanda and the role of mass media, especially the radio host, in promoting the genocidal acts, where they were rooting to kill people and rape them. They were actually glorifying that. I believe somebody on national television in Israel tried to talk about how this humanitarian crisis in Gaza might be hurtful to Israel, and he immediately was scolded. And we see people on national television saying we need to kill more, 100,000 from day one, and then more every day. I mean,
there are people that are expressing support for Hamas, and they're cheering the death of Israeli civilians. And my point is, you have to condemn this wherever it is, and there are people who only want to talk about it on one side.
Never seen, even if some people probably cheer what Hamas did and whatever, but I never seen this as mainstream. Actually, the poll suggests that Hamas popularity before the attack was reduced.
Very low.
Attack still is not really that great.
There are some polls that came out since, which I would take with a grain of salt, because when people are getting bombed, they feel differently than they normally do. And the poll had a very small sample size for Gaza, and the uptick in support was in the West Bank and not Gaza, which is interesting. But that's only one or two polls. There's so many more polls before that show Hamas is unpopular.
They reject the whole idea that Palestinians are genocidal. They are not. They're not. I mean,
I don't think Palestinians. I want to be absolutely clear, Rula. I just want to be absolutely clear. I don't think that Palestinians in general.
I didn't see mass cheering of the mass killing that happened on October 7th. I did not see that. If you have evidence, please, I'm happy to look at them and be clear about them. But this is not even before October 7th, the cheering for mass killing of Palestinians. You have just to look at discourses in the Israeli parliament or the discourse in the Israeli television. The mass marches on Jerusalem saying, kill all the Arabs, kick them out, has been so normalized, and it's mainstream. It's mainstream.
I don't disagree at all. The only point I'm making is that I think you've done this. I think you've done a good job with this, that there are a lot of people out there who only want to say this happens on one side and it doesn't happen at all on the other, and they pretend it doesn't happen on their side. And the Israelis do this all the time. They always talk about the incitement of Palestinians.
In the Palestinian people, I'm convinced that there are a small margin of people in the Palestinian community who think violence is the path forward. You know who's validating these voices? Israel itself, because they're telling Palestinians the only option we're giving you to die or to die. To kill or to kill.
Yes, because cooperation doesn't end the occupation. Peaceful cooperation and coexistence doesn't get rewarded.
And the international community is telling us you need to die in silence. So if you leave no option except violence, that's the language that will be rising up from the other side. That's the only strategy that will be afforded to the Palestinians. Unlike, the strategy of the surge in Iraq and other surges. But I refuse and reject to say that the mass normalization of violence of the Israeli side is because it's a consequence of what happened from the Palestinians. It is not. It is a consequence of delusional power and lack of accountability. But also, it's the hubris of power to think that you can get away with it. You can say it, and America will support you regardless. You can do it, and America and the West will support you regardless. And not only that, you're entitled to kill others because you were a victim yourself once upon a time. It's a kind of madness. I never seen anything like this before. And I think this is the madness that we need to discuss. This is a disease. I'm sorry to say that.
Clearly, and the thing is, you brought up when you had that great moment. I'm going to post the video where you basically really schooled Ben Shapiro, who is very annoying on a lot of these topics. You brought up the IRA. You brought up, that's my grandparents. My grandparents fled Ireland in the early 1920s during the Civil War to escape 800 years of occupation. And that's why I'm American. And so you look at these conflicts, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Kashmir, there are many other places where there are long-time occupations or long-time mass oppression, like Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. Terrorism doesn't just come from nowhere usually. More often than not, sometimes you have your ISIS and your Al-Qaeda. They're not typical. What's typical is the PLO, the Tamil Tigers, Hezbollah. coming directly out of occupation and oppression, where peaceful means do not work, they get nowhere, and people resort to violence because they feel they have no other option. And that's my biggest criticism of Netanyahu, is that he has not only not worked towards building a partner and incentivizing cooperation by rewarding positive things, he is encouraging the very worst in his society. He's encouraging division and hate. In that way, he is very much like Trump, but more dangerous because he's far more competent. And it's just terrifying to me because I look at where Israel is now, and I look at the effect that something like October 7th must have. I know people who were liberal, queer, and for pro-Palestine positions who now say, I don't care anymore about the Palestinians after what happened on October 7th. And I'm just terrified of the direction that Israel goes and the way that it's possible that Biden's presidency could even come undone because of this issue. And that would be such a disaster for democracy in the world, for Trump and Netanyahu to somehow triumph together, because when they were empowered together, so many bad things were already happening.
Look, I remember President Obama, and this is the President of the United States, who said, ISIS is the outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, which is the outgrowth of our invasion of Iraq. He could say that easily, debating US policies, and we're not allowed to even question the role of Israel's 6-decade military occupation in paving the way for mass radicalization and mass violence. Violence is not an outgrowth of people woke up one morning or they instinctively are violent. They are savages, they're animals. They grow up and like, oh, we need to go out and kill people.
But that's how Israel tries to portray it all the time.
Palestinians, like all people, they want to live a normal life. They want to live as free men and women. They want to live with dignity. They want their own state and our countries. We're no different than the Irish. We're no different than the Swedes or the Germans or any other population.
Now, Ireland was pretty violent, and they would target civilians. They looked like Hamas. They wore baklavas. They had AK-47s. They had bandanas. Like, they literally trained in Libya with Gaddafi. I mean, this is what desperate people with no other recourse do. They resort to violent resistance. And what did Israel do between 1967 and 1987 when there was no Hamas? And the PLO was a fringe small group operating outside of Israel on the borders, hijacking some airplanes, but they didn't affect Israeli daily life very much. What was going on for those 20 years before Hamas came into being in 1987?
And look, I remember also Hillary Clinton said the US created Al-Qaeda. It's now we can easily say that Netanyahu helped grow and strengthen Hamas. He's the same man that is.
He admitted it. He said it out loud. This isn't a point. People are saying, "Oh, Rula, you're making things up." No, he has actually admitted this.
This is part of his policy. He said, this is part of our strategy. He said it to his Likud party. He said it over and over and again. So again, I think it's time to start questioning.
He has failed. Do you think they realize that there's no military solution? There has to be a political solution for the Palestinians, even if they're fighting this war now. After, there has to be a political solution. Do you think they realize that?
Now, the only way, and I'm not a big fan of Ehud Olmert, but Ehud Olmert and sensible, smart Israeli politicians who care about Israel's survival and who care about Israeli Jewish lives are saying we need now to enable and to enact a permanent solution. I mean, even Ariel Sharon at his, 2003 in a meeting, he said, we cannot occupy these people forever in perpetuity. This is military occupation. It's producing violence. We need to do something about it. Netanyahu was sitting in that meeting angry because for him, it's about power and Jewish supremacy and the settlement and the whole idea of these religious fanatics that a piece of land is more important than the life of the people who live on that land. And in the name of that ethno-nationalist fascist state, people are now around the world are waking up, including Jewish kids who are in the United States protesting against their own parents, against the establishment, against Biden. They voted in masses for Biden, and now they're telling him, we will stay home if you will force us to swallow a genocide. We will stay home if you will force us to choose between Trump and Netanyahu, because the choices are another war and Bibi Netanyahu and ethno-nationalism. Why would we want to enable ethno-nationalism in Palestine? We were telling people to vote against it here in America, in Europe, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. Why?
So I've heard you talk recently about two-state solution. And I actually, people tell me I'm crazy, but I think it's way less crazy than the idea of the one-state solution. Can you explain why you support the two-state solution and not the one-state solution? I'll offer my own thoughts on that too, because I think we probably agree for some of the same reasons. But I'm glad that, because I think more and more people keep saying one-state solution, and I'm just scratching my head. How does that actually work?
Look, at this point, Palestinians are fighting for their survival and continuation as a nation. Israel was giving many opportunity, whether one-state solution, two-state solution, federation, whatever they want, whatever terms. But the only way forward is to end the military occupation and to live as free human beings, all of us, because none of us are free or safe until we're all free. And at this, even
flying home, we talked about this before. You're an Israeli citizen, and you're not even comfortable many times trying to fly back to Israel because of how you're treated and whether or not you even be allowed back in.
As an American and European who was born in the Middle East, this is my homeland. And this government terrifies me. Even though my family is, multi-religious and multi-ethnic, because our ethnicity is a threat to the ethno-national state, to the fascist ideals that are behind it, that you need to comply, that you have to have, the purity and of the blood as determination if you will have certain rights or not. I think they're unleashing this kind of doctrine, and they want the Middle East to be subjugated and be ruled by an ideology that is extinct, that doesn't bring anything except death and destruction and more violence, that is condemning all of us to 100 years wars. I'm not only scared for myself. I think Palestinians are looking at the reality and they know that the extermination project is already being implemented, that what's being carried out is a real genocide against all our people, whether you're in Gaza, in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and elsewhere, that the ethno-fascists in Israel will continue to consolidate power, and the reality will not change unless America's approach changes, which is conditioning military aid, which is more accountability and more transparency. America cannot continue to talk about democracy and human rights while enable and protect and arm ethno-nationalism, military occupation, and illegal military occupation that is rooted in illegality and in violence and breeding more and more violence. This is jeopardizing the Middle East, is blowing up the entire Middle East and dismantling America's credibility in the world. What I think the most
may be coming. You have Bernie Sanders and Chris Murphy and a bunch of people, not just the squad as they're called, but a bunch of people. And I was including Seth Moulton, Iraq war veteran, very sensible. And I have a lot of respect for Ilhan Omar and AOC, even if I don't always agree with them. So I'm not painting them as not credible, but even more moderate people are saying we should start conditioning aid based on what's happening. And I haven't heard that from the Senate before. There are a number of senators saying that. And there's a conversation that's happening now that wasn't happening before.
No, the regime change that is taking place in Israel, it's a regime against democracy. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli protested against.
The last person I had on that was she was covering the protests and the judicial coup. I mean, he's not just bad for Palestinians, he's bad for Israeli Jews as well. He's bad for everybody. And people don't understand this.
They're protesting in Israel to save their democracy, but they were comfortable with the occupation on the other side. They don't understand that the whole structure system that enabled Bibi Netanyahu to form this government, the most extreme government, the most racist government in its history, they're not going to implement their judicial coup and also consolidate apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. I think they are trying to thwart America's democracy itself by legitimizing more and more voices within the establishment, both democratic and that see Israel as a model to follow, as the city on the hill or the city that is, guarded city with walls, when they talk about the wall in the South, and when they talk about the wall in Texas, I think they're looking at walls in Israel and that kind of formula and how to exclude or include certain people. And certain people, and only certain people, have certain rights. It is astonishing that people don't see the parallel between the MAGA movement and what Israel is being implementing.
I'll send you. I was lucky. I got published by the London School of Economics Middle East Center, where I called it "Tainted Love," how basically the Netanyahu and Trump and Israel-U.S. relationship is corrupting itself, and that they're embracing their own worst tendencies. Which I think that was back in 2017. I wrote that. I don't remember exactly what the year was, but it was. Yeah, I've been seeing that, and it's terrifying to me the way that they fed each other. And now I think that there's two types of Jewish Americans, I think, that are changing their mind about things. There are some that look at October 7th, and it's making them more supportive of Republicans who are more supportive of Israel. But then there's the younger people who are less inclined to support Biden because they think he's not doing enough to help the Palestinians. And so I don't know if there's going to be a significant shift in the Jewish vote, because they feel that way now. Things could change within a year, but there could be a significant shift in the Jewish vote. I don't think it'll be a majority, but if you go from 80% down to 70 or 65, that's a big deal.
Brian, what we need to talk about is Biden, he doesn't have to support the Palestinians. He has to stand with the principle of international law. It's not about supporting or aiding or defending Palestinians or Israel's democracy itself, saving it from itself. He has to stand with his own principle that he implemented in Ukraine. He has to ask Israel to comply with international law, with America's own law, the Leahy law, that clearly indicate that you cannot give to units, military units, that are committing war crimes and genocide.
By the way, you know who John Paul is? He was the State Department official who resigned. I actually met him a few weeks before he ended up resigning, but he believed so strongly in that he quit his position at the State Department.
And a lot of people are resigning in protest because they're appalled. They're disgusted by what Biden is doing, because it's betrayal of the promise of democracy itself. This is not even about Palestinians. This will set a precedent that nobody is safe anywhere. No one is safe.
I did want to know why you support the two-state solution. I've heard you say that as opposed to the one-state solution.
I didn't say I support two-state or one state. I just want a solution. I want people to survive. I want the killing of children to stop. I want to preserve a democracy that is multi-ethnic, multiracial. And I would like to see a world where human rights are not dismissed, are protected, where the sanctity of life actually is valid for everybody, where people are not placed as inferior or superior human being based on ethnicity and their race and their religion, and less militarism and maybe more diplomacy. And I do not care if it's one state or two states. I think the reality on the ground suggests that it will be very hard to have a two states. So whether it's a federation, I honestly, at this point, just stop killing children and allow the process, the political process, the only one that can work to save hostages, to save Israel democracy, but also to open a pathway for Palestinians. So violence is not the only language and not the only option they are left with.
But at this point, you're very pessimistic. You don't think the U.S. administration will stop Israel, and you think they're going to kill way more than the number that we're being given now, and they're going to displace the people of Gaza. That's how you see this
Yes.
going. I hope you're wrong. I've already explained why I disagree, but I hope you're wrong. But you're my guest, so I want people to know that that's your prognostication. And I really hope if that happens, I will be reassessing a number of things. I think personally, it's going to get worse than it is now, even. So we're not even at the lowest point. It's going to get worse, but then it's going to get better. And I think we're talking months.
I think I would love you to send me any analysis, my written analysis. Why would it be getting better at any point? I mean, when you have mass protests, 80% of Democrats asking for a ceasefire, the whole world asking for a ceasefire, and Biden shrugging his shoulders, even after Netanyahu said there will be no two-state solution, after minister after minister in Israeli cabinet saying they will implement the same thing in the West Bank. Why would Biden listen? He's
I
not listening to his
I
own
can't
case.
prove it. I just from everything I'm looking in terms of statements and what people are doing and what's being reported from behind the scenes, I'm interpreting that wheels and gears are in motion, slowly but speeding up, that are going to shift things if Israel doesn't shift its behavior. Maybe I'm wrong, but we'll see what happens.
I promise you it's a lie. You will wake up like I do and look at reality for what it is, and you will see that this is on Biden. He could have avoided all of this, and he could have somehow mitigated Israel's response, yet he decided that he's fine, he's comfortable. By the way, in 82, Biden was a senator, young senator, when Israel invaded Lebanon, when Reagan was complaining with the Israeli about their savagery and the mass killing. Biden was comfortable with that. He said he was not only comfortable with that, he actually suggested to the Israelis they're not killing enough. That was in 82. So if there's any indication of Biden tolerance and threshold for violence, I could say that it is equivalent to Bibi Netanyahu, if not more.
Well, you articulated very well. You've made your views about why you're frustrated, very angry and disappointed, and really heartbroken by the U.S. response, by the Biden administration's response. You've really gotten into a lot of the details about the West Bank and Gaza and the international situation and a lot of the history, some of your personal history, the fact that your novel and the movie, which I'm excited to read the novel first and then watch the movie. It's on the way, the novel. And again, you're such an extraordinary person who's been able to do screenplays, featured on all kinds of TV stations and newspapers and magazines, even Annie Leibovitz photographing you for Vogue magazine. So the accomplishments and the variety of accomplishments you've had in your life are very impressive, and I am eager to do this again to talk about other issues. You obviously have opinions about American politics. I think what's going on in Italy is so important to people, that people need to understand what's happening there, because that's very scary. You've been calling out fascism in a way that Orwell would be proud for years, so it's been really wonderful having you. And if is there any final point that you would like to make to the audience, or anything that you feel like you're not asked enough about on TV or in these op-eds that you want to say that you haven't had the chance to really say elsewhere?
You know, for me, an important thing to put this in a global context. This is not an isolated episode that's happening geographically in one location. This will have an international implication on the rise of the far right in Europe. I think the far right and the MAGA movement in America is emboldened by what's happening. They will use what's happening in Gaza as blueprint, sadly, and a roadmap to implement it elsewhere. And sadly, this is happening under Biden, under a Democratic president. A Democratic president, by his action and inactions, is paving the way, facilitating the way, and providing ammunition directly and indirectly, legal ammunition, real ammunition to dismantle rule-based international order. And I think for a generation to come, we will look at his presidency as one of the worst presidency in terms of dismantlement of America's standing in the world and rule-based international order.
And do you think, besides obviously Gaza is a huge issue, Israel's a huge issue, it's not like, well, other than that, but do you see other examples, or do you think that until this, what you see as a catastrophic blunder and hypocrisy on the part of the Biden administration?
Not only Gaza. I start seeing this when he appointed these people who believe that the Abraham Accord could be a substitute for real accords, when he and his people basically threw under the bus Shireen Abu Akleh, the American journalist that was killed by a sniper in the occupied territories, and basically muzzled her family. And they were complaining to her family, we're under so much pressure. We cannot really ask Israel to, we can't hold Israel accountable for killing an American journalist. So I could see the weakness and I could see the cowardness. But what we're seeing now is setting the stage for obliteration of, the global order, because China is watching.
The global South doesn't have any, now when they hear us talk about Ukraine, they just roll their eyes because of Gaza.
China is looking at this as precedent they can use in the future. Russia is, probably laughing at what's happening and thinking, oh yeah, you really told us about Ukraine for a year and a half. Now we will take advantage of what's happening, and they are. and other countries. I mean, we're looking at really a conflagration of conflict around the world because they will use Gaza as an example to follow.
And I take your point, by the way, about the Abraham Accords, because what I felt that was a way for Israel to try and say, see, we can make peace without the Palestinians and ignore them, and we can get everything we want. And to me, that was always delusional, and that was an accelerator of turning into what we're seeing now, because there was going to be some kind of massive reaction to the Palestinians being ignored and sidelined for so long, for so many years, which was, again, the explicit policy of Netanyahu, that I actually think the Abraham Accords were counterproductive, because Israel already had working relationships with the Saudis and the UAE, Morocco, but these countries were not really at war with Israel anyway, so it didn't substantively change a whole lot. It certainly made the Palestinians feel even more marginalized, more ignored, and more isolated. And it certainly gave Netanyahu and other Israelis the confidence to think that they could get away with ignoring the Palestinians. And they were literally being rewarded for ignoring the Palestinians. So I take your point very much there.
The whole issue to normalize with Arab regime somehow, even if they didn't include a portion for the Palestinians, it did not lead to curbing the violence against Palestinians. Actually, during this period, after the signing of the Abraham Accords, more Palestinians died in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, more were killed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, during the holiest month of Ramadan, was being stormed by Israeli forces and people beating up worshippers while they were praying. And so the Abraham Accord legitimized brute force and violence against Palestinians. And I think part of the reason why Israelis thought, oh, we can legitimize with this regime because they don't care about Palestinians. They might not care, but guess what? 90%, 92% of the Saudis, they don't want normalization with Israel now. And 99% of Arabs across the Middle East, a region of 400 million people, think Israel is an occupying force and is the driver of all violence in the Middle East. I mean,
and Israel has not helped its reputation. I don't think it realizes that it's done a lot of damage to itself.
They don't care. They think America's protection can trump everything else.
There's public opinion in America, public opinion shifting against Israel in a way it hasn't previously. There's been a big drop.
Social media opened a window to looking into what Israelis are doing and saying. And for the first time, we have a shift. Mainstream media is catching up slowly, but I think now we live in an aquarium, Brian, where everything is visible. What happened in Israel this morning in seconds can reach the United States. So it's a good thing. And I think for the first time we see, voices like mine, including the conversation, 2 minutes, it doesn't matter. But in those minutes, it's very important because you are telling Americans that, oh, not all, we've been sold a narrative that all of these people are savages and barbarians and we need to exterminate them. Maybe there's something else beneath all of this, state propaganda.
I'm going to come here and talk much longer than 2 minutes as you did today. You've been very, very generous with your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was my very long, in-depth interview with Rula, Jebreal, and be sure to check the podcast page notes for information on her book and some of her other articles, for some of the work and topics that were referenced, both hers and mine, and for some additional context. But again, her perspective is important to hear out. It's important to acknowledge, and it demonstrates, regardless of whether I'm right or she's right, it demonstrates that there's an enormous amount of effort that needs to be undertaken by the Biden administration after this fighting is over to rebuild relationships, to rebuild trust that had been very damaged by what's been happening. And some would argue as Rula has, by the Biden administration's actions and inactions. I would see it differently, but I definitely understand that perspective. And in particular, it's much harder to convince people that words and behind the scenes pressure are good enough, or are a sincere effort, when we see what we see every day happening to people in Gaza. And so I'm very sympathetic to that perspective, even though I have a different perspective. And I really do hope with all my heart that I'm right. because if I'm wrong, if Rula's right, the situation is far, far worse and uglier, and going to be far, far worse and uglier than it is even now. I also, as I mentioned, do think it's going to get worse before it gets better, but I am still confident, and I'll be getting into this in the future, either in writing or in other podcasts, that sooner rather than later, there is going to be a major shift, a reduction in violence, and a beginning of the end of this conflict in Gaza, the fighting and violence in Gaza, and then things really can, and I believe will, get better. I may very well be wrong. It might be too late. Rula certainly makes that case, and we shall see what happens. And I'll be eager to have her again, because there's so many other topics that she covers that would be great to get into with her, in particular Italy, American politics, and the international situation with the far right rising everywhere almost. So that would be great to discuss with her, and I was really honored to have her on and look forward to having her again. And so to help me out with that, make sure to share, get this out there, email, post on social media, all that good stuff. Get this podcast out there so that this perspective can be heard, this discussion can be heard, and thank you all so much for listening.